Alrighty, hello everyone. Welcome to another Sunday, which means another Lorebeards. Are we live? Okay, I know we're live on Twitch. Are we live on YouTube? I don't see it.
I'm doing my Middenheim impression while we wait.
There it is. Your Middenheim impression.
It's a very good Middenheim impression. And in fact, I think it's quite a topical part of the Middenheim impression because Middenheim has more than one version. We have this version and we have this version.
No, yeah. Okay, a couple little housekeeping things before we just jump into it. First of all, if you haven't already, please make sure to check out the most recent episode of Who Would Win over on the Lawhammer channel. The vote for that is still up and will continue to be up until pretty much we start the next episode this upcoming Wednesday, which that's already up. So make sure to go vote because it's actually very close. There's less than, I think it's like 7 or 8% between. Tyrion is currently in the lead, but you can change that if you want. So make sure to go vote. I would love to see that get to 10,000 votes. That would be awesome.
Oh, that'd be amazing, wouldn't it?
I think right now it's at like 7 or 8, but that would be excellent. Other than that, I think we're pretty much good to get into things. And I think Andy will, as always, pretty much have a good intro for us.
Oh, I'm always ready for an intro. This is, for me, a favorite topic. I have used Middenheim, the city, pretty much since I was a teenager. And I have been not just writing about it professionally or playing with it in all of my games, but thinking about it, trying to figure out exactly what it looks like or doesn't look like, actually visiting other cities with similar qualities to try and get a better grip of what it's like, and then finding out that the city that I currently live in is one of the best examples of a city that has similar qualities to Middenheim that are out there. But to cut a long story short, Middenheim is probably one of my favorite locations in the entire Warhammer world. And that's not just because it's something that has focused in multiple stories, including stories that I've been involved with myself. It's because it's a location that has gone through, I think, almost the story of Warhammer. And by that, I mean it has changed and changed and changed again according to the needs of Games Workshop over time, and ultimately became the focal point of the end times, showing just how important that city was, not just to Warhammer, but to Games Workshop and to what it represented as Warhammer as a whole to the staff that were writing on that project, because Middenheim had been central to pretty much everything that was Warhammer through its various iterations in one way or another. So I am really looking forward to doing a relatively big deep dive into that. But before we do that, and much like every single week, we're going to be taking any super chats or any good old cheers that are coming in from across the internet from you lovely people on YouTube and Twitch. And we take them in batches. We'll just about take our first batch since some are already in, you marvelous people. We love you so much. And as we go through each topic and each individual part, we'll have a quick stop. We'll check through all those, and then we'll dive back into the next bit. So I shall lean back and say, what have they said first, Mr. Sotek?
Let's jump on into it. So we got Zar94, thank you very much. Due to traveling, I may not get to participate in this one, but I look forward to painting my Tomb Kings while listening to it this evening. Well, that's excellent. Yeah, I got a whole bunch of Lizardman models sent in, like a lot, and I'm trying to decide if I want to do them in Orward or AOS. I'm having a hard time with that one. Ray Shimon, hey Andy, it's so good to see you guys again. Well, good to see you. Thank you very much for the super chat. Appreciate it. Schwarza, you've said this every week. I don't know if you know this. We're not employed with Creative Assembly. We have no control over the TimerCon situation, but we appreciate you bringing it up every week. Thank you. But just so you know, we're not angle.
The next one's a good one.
Yeah. Zetro, did you both see the Gnome Blood Bowl team? Yes, we did. I still can't believe it's real, to be completely honest.
I would like to take full responsibility for that existing at all. I don't think that's entirely fair, but obviously I reintroduced the gnomes back into Warhammer on 4th edition, and it was at that point, well, it must be about 4 or 5 years ago now, deeply controversial. So controversial it caused arguments, I know, back at head office, because some people didn't think it was very Warhammer, other people thought it was super Warhammer, and clearly that debate has had some form of resolution, because we have, for the first time in decades, official Games Workshop gnome miniatures. How freaking cool is that?
Yeah, I think the last time there was official gnome minis was 4th edition, 3rd edition. Yeah, old.
Third.
Old.
Way back. We're talking when I was a teenager, and for those of you who don't know how old I am, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, that's wild. But hey, the squats are back, gnomes are back. Just bring it all back.
No reason why they shouldn't be. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, it's great. Muffin Basket. Hey, dudes, climbed up a bend today whilst listening to you lovely folks rambled about Malagor in my ears. Keep them coming, folks.
We certainly shall
do that. And just to get ahead of it, because I know somebody's going to say it, for those of you that listen to the podcast format, I'm working on it. I'm on it. All right, I know. Hammond, why is Middenland impregnable? The Middenheimen is still intact.
OMG, Hammond.
Man, that would be a hilarious thing for a Reichlander to say.
I am so tempted to use that joke.
Wow, that's a good one. That's a good one.
It's a bad one.
It's bad, but it's I'm impressed.
Wow.
Necromancer Kobold, will we learn about the bringer of Todd's today and why he's missing an eye? It'll come up a little
he'll
bit,
probably be mentioned here and there, but we're not talking the story of the Todd bringers. We're talking the story of Middenheim itself, which obviously includes the Todd bringers right at the very end, but that's only one part of the overall city.
Small bit. Fiance's B-Day today, so I will catch up during the week. Have a great stream, gents. Bought my first ever mini this week, 90s 5th edition Green Knight that has not been opened. Don't tell my fiance.
Oh, I imagine that costs more than your house. I love it.
Yeah, especially because your fiance would go, wait, aren't they just selling a reprint of that for much cheaper? Hi, Oso6 by Ulric. Can't wait to listen to this. Lorebeards will build some Empire troops. Perfect stream for Empire troops. Michael Thomas, hey nerds. Well, hello there. Good to see you. Inquisitor Thomas, hey, my favorite CA employees. Can we please get Lumbria added as a race pack? As soon as we figure out what the hell that would even be, sure. How vindicated do you feel about the gnomes getting models, Andy?
Actually, a lot.
I was going to say, I feel like there's someone out there you need to email and be like, I told you. I told you so.
Well, there is someone out there that I would like to email to say we were right. I haven't done so, but I have considered doing so. There's also someone out there that I would like to email that I would like to say, you were wrong. Like, really, really wrong. But I'm not that kind of guy. I'm just sitting on it going, well, that's a thing that happened. That's marvelous. Great. Cheers.
Andy, why or why not should a Zinch wizard, may or may not be a gnome, have a staff besides incognito? That's a lot of like or nots added. That is a confusing sentence.
I'll admit, Mandatus, I'm not quite sure what you're asking because pretty much every wizard can have themselves a staff. So not quite sure what I'm supposed to be answering there. Why or why not should a Zinch wizard may or not be he should just have one if he wants one.
Isn't Toddy just Crimlo? Isn't it just fucking Crimlo? No, nothing can compare to Crimlo. Nothing is as horrible and as unsettling as an athletic frog man thing.
Gelt. Sometimes I just think, just to appease you, that it's very possible if you took that mask off, you would just find yourself a frogman.
Crimlo is Gelt all along. Tech, who would win between a halfling and a gnome? A, hilarious idea for an episode. B, it would depend on many circumstances. How do you determine who wins? Anthony, currently wiping out the Empire is Skaven in Warhammer 3. Oh boy, the heresy. It's just the Black Plague all over again. And also, real quick, thank you to Hawk Oddly and Super Ego for the resubs. Appreciate it. And I'm glad y'all are excited for some Middenheim stuff. So let's get into it. And we'll keep an eye out, Mandatus, for your clarification comment. Make Crimlo ride an Arcane Phoenix. You know what? Sure. Why not? If Teclis can ride an Arcane Phoenix, why not Crimlo? So, Middenheim, like Andy said, one of the things that's super interesting about this place in particular is that Middenheim has longer than I've been around, probably, been a focal point in Warhammer Fantasy. Even throughout different editions and different storylines, it is featured as a super important place where every time Games Workshop tried to do an end time scenario, it always featured on Middenheim, where the Storm of Chaos had Middenheim as like the backdrop for the big epic final battle. And then the actual fate of the Warhammer world was determined at Middenheim. And that is where the Warhammer world ultimately fell. Because Middenheim was so important, it got 2 epic battles, because there was the Siege of Middenheim, followed later by the Battle of Middenheim with the Council of Incarnates. It is a place that is deeply, deeply important. So we're gonna, I think a good thing for us to try and figure out for today is why.
Fortunately, we have some form of an answer for that. But to slowly but surely meander our way towards that answer, let's start off with Middenheim. Where did that even come from in the first place? So, as I am wont to do, let us take us all back through the mists of time to when you had Andy the teenager. There was no beard in those days, and his hair was far more ginger than you might expect. My wife likes to refer to it as blonde. I think more browny ginger is appropriate. And I was a young kid, and I was enjoying the Enemy Within campaign. If you don't know out there, the Enemy Within campaign is a selection of adventures for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay that defined the Empire as we know it today. It pretty much defined much of what Warhammer became. And it was started off in the late 80s. And a part of that campaign featured in the City of the North, the Great City of the North, that had been mentioned multiple times in previous books, but had never really been detailed. And it was called Middenheim. Now, Middenheim had some very loose, let's say, lore attached to it. But when I say loose, I mean loose. This is the book that defined it. And this book was never meant to exist in the first place. What was actually supposed to happen was that good old Carl Sargent, who was writing the Power Behind the Throne section of The Enemy Within, well, he went a little bit, let's just say, mad. He went a bit busy. And he wrote so much material, and he and the team that were working on it wrote so much material around Middenheim that they had far too much to go into the Power Behind the Throne itself. So that extra material became Middenheim, City of Chaos, because of the nature of the adventure that was being dealt with at the time. Subtitled The City of the White Wolf, and we'll get on to exactly why that's the case. And this book added a further, I think it was the first one was 96 pages worth of detail concerning Middenheim. Now, this is all the way back at the cusp point of the 80s and the 90s. And this defined not just Middenheim, but what a Warhammer city was in many respects, how Warhammer city books will be treated in future. And it's fair to say, is the only book that we got until Marienburg, and then yawningly far into the future, about a Warhammer city. So it was the only book that writers really had to refer to if they were going to find a city in the Empire. So lots of books referenced Middenheim. Lots of authors referenced Middenheim. When authors who were brought in to write short stories had a short story to write, they either used Middenheim or Marienburg, all too frequently, because they had detail, and they had detail that they could reference to. Meaning that throughout the course of the 90s and then into the noughties, Middenheim popped up again and again and again and again, and was considered to be a point of not just importance, because it was an important city, but a point of certainty because it had background written about it. And everyone was told, if you want to write about that, go read that book first. Meaning that there was a level of consistency with Middenheim that didn't exist elsewhere in the lore. And we'll go into the details of the lore and exactly what it is in just a moment. But before we do that, let's just quickly run through the rest of the timeline of the city and how it got to where it got to. We eventually reached the Storm of Chaos. Now, we're deep into late Warhammer editions now, and a great summer campaign was put into place, and it was at the very top run by Gav Thorpe. And a story was built behind this campaign, which was, if I was going to break it down into its simplest components, the Ever-Chosen goes and does the Ever-Chosen thing and heads south with a bunch of warlords to kick ass and chew gum. Throughout the world, conflict rises up. Effectively, it's the great incursion of chaos. And contrary to what everybody expected when they originally set it up, Chaos didn't just lose this battle, they lost it so decisively that it was almost hilarious. That, however, is an incidental point to the culminating point of this campaign, because Archaon, and the background for what his choice was, the Everchosen, was his plan was to kill the god of Sigmar, Sigmar's god. It was to come down to Middenheim and destroy the god of Sigmar. Now, you might go, so who's the god of Sigmar and why would it be in Middenheim? We'll get to that in just a moment. But again, to cut the whole story short, Middenheim is a center of faith for one of the great cults of the Empire, the cult of Ulric, the god of winter, warfare, and wolves. And this god not just is centered there, but has a great holy site, which we'll also get onto very soon. Archaon intended to pop down there, do some god killing, and break the Empire by doing so, because he would send it cut right down the middle, or so he planned. That plan did not come to pass, because Middenheim, as we will discuss, is a really, 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 really hard place to take down, because Middenheim is not like other cities. This story was then repeated in the end times. It wasn't repeated in detail, but it was in terms of overall theme. And that is, Middenheim is important. It is the central culminating point of the campaign. And come the end times, as was already discussed, it was used not once, but twice as a central focal point for the battles that described the end of the world, until the world itself blew up around Middenheim, for want of a better description. And that brings us up to, loosely, today, where the book has, the city has recently had another book written about it. That was a book that I originally produced and then quit the company, and let other people finish off on my behalf. And is a city that gets referenced again and again. But it is going to be worth noting that as we go through some of its history, as we go through some of its core components and locations and important folks that have been around that area, it has changed over time. But like the biggest, most important of Games Workshop locations, you'll find that those changes often get rewritten back to the original again and again and again as new writers come in. So they start off with the original, they start turning it into something else, and then a new writer comes along and says, but the original says this, and ties it back in and tries to rope it all together again. So it's a place that has changed multiple ways over time, but at its heart has, broadly speaking, maintained the same core throughout. There really is only one major point about the city that has never really been properly nailed down in a way that actually makes sense, and that's its population and what it actually looks like.
Yeah. But before we hop into that, we're going to get caught up on some Super Chat goodies, and then we will dive into more specific stuff. So here is, okay, well, first, good morning, gentlemen. All glory to Crimlow. Praise his name. He came from space. He
did. Praise his name.
And
praise his name.
Go back and die in the vacuum. That one guy, gonna be burning Middenheim to the ground. My Archaon campaign during this stream. Well, he has had a couple swings at it, so maybe he'll get it this time. Viper Wolf, is the giant cannon loaded by a giant still cannon? Funny sentence. But it depends on which version you're looking at. I believe in the most recent version by Cubicle 7, Ulric's, I think it's called Ulric's Roar,
Ulric's Hammer.
Fury. Ulric's Hammer. It is.
I've got it on my map. Wait a minute. I'll just check it.
Yeah, I don't believe it's mentioned in the most recent book. It definitely was not in the end times.
Just because a thing isn't mentioned doesn't mean it's not there, though. You tend to find it will be one of those things that will be there if they require. It's Ulric's Thunder. And it will be there if required, or they'll ignore it when they don't. Middenheim has had multiple new things added, subtracted, and then added back again, according to the writers at hand.
Yeah, I believe the last time it was mentioned was the Storm of Chaos. Doesn't mean it's not still there, but it hasn't been mentioned since. It did get some kick-ass artwork, though, for the Storm of Chaos book.
Good bit of art.
Biofoot, thank you for all the bits. Of all the bars and all of the back alleys and all of Middenheim, she just had to walk into mine. She was a fish person. That's probably a reference to a song that I don't know because I'm not cultured. Warpstoner, is the Fauschlag the dwarf watchtower? We will get into the whole business of the dwarf city underneath Middenheim and that whole cluster mess very soon. So stay tuned for that. And Mandanta's better worded question. Why does essentially every wizard or witch or caster in Warhammer, regardless of their culture or species, use a staff?
Okay, that's a broader question. And loosely speaking, because there are a varieties of ways that you will want to extend the reach of touch spells, and there's a variety of materials that allow you to do so, and they can also be double purpose to store magic, do other things with magic. Effectively, they're a tool. And they're a tool that enhances your ability at magic if they're well made, and they can also do things like increase range for certain spells that normally would not be beyond your own reach and your own actual touch.
All right, so with that, I think it would be worth taking a minute to talk about the messiness of Middenheim, and then after that, we can get into like the actual lore, going like way back in history and working our way forwards.
So, which part of the messiness would you like to engage with first? Because there's a lot.
I think the most important one to start with would be the what Middenheim actually is, like what it looks like and how it's designed. Because
all right, let's pull up an image then.
Oh,
just like that. Right now, I'm bringing this image up in particular because I'm going to change the window in a moment, because this was an image that I commissioned. Can I zoom in that at all? I can't because it's on the wrong window. I'll change it later. Okay, now I commissioned this image for a particular reason, because Middenheim had been through multiple different iterations, and we wanted to pretty much make it clear what Middenheim looked like. Now, you might notice that we've got ourselves a big rise of a city off towards the left-hand side of the screen, and that big rise is Middenheim, and it's got causeways that run up towards it. You'll see one of them snaking up from the foreground into it, and in the background, you'll see another causeway just connecting Middenheim through to the Middle Mountains. So the Middle Mountains rise off to the side, and Middenheim is on the very last rock, if you will, of the Middle Mountains. And it rises up over the top of it. Now, you might think that that means that Middenheim is built on this big spire of rock. It's not really. It's a multi-layered city. It's on a big chunk of rock that's got an uneven top that was at one point boshed off, but there's a big legend about that. And there's also several contradictory versions of that. But Middenheim itself is actually pretty huge. If we take a look at it there, we'll see that this isn't a town of some 10 or 20,000 folks. This is a proper city, at the top of which is the great Middenplatz, where good old Boris Todbringer rules all of Middenland, if we're using the current version, the 8th edition of Warhammer. And it is quite the impressive city. Now, one of the major reasons that it's impressive is if you pull back from this. I'm not sure if I just bring it up full screen, it doesn't really give you a good opportunity.
If you hold down Control and use your mouse wheel, it should move it closer.
Oh yeah, that's much better. Thanks very much for whoever sent that one over. Can I choose where it zooms to? Yeah, not really. That'll do. So we get ourselves a pretty good idea there of the city. Can you see my mouse? There we go. We've got the causeway in the background there. We've got the main causeway reading up there. And if we look here, the buildings across this section stop, and it drops and it drops and it drops right off the screen for some considerable distance down to the ground. Now, these great causeways were built by the dwarves. Think of the great dwarven sky bridges that they use up in the mountains. And these sky bridges are the foundational technology that was used to build these causeways into Middenheim, of which there's 4 of them, a north, south, east, and west. The one that you can see in the background there is the eastern causeway. The eastern causeway attaches Middenheim through, as I said, to the Middle Mountains, and it's much more of a traditional bridge, where this one, which is the southern causeway, actually snakes out and attaches to a great rise of rock further away from Middenheim. Now, the only way to properly besiege this city is to either go up the causeways, which, by the way, are covered in dwarven runes and yes, can explode, or alternatively, scale it. And trust me when I say that's not going to be an easy option. The Storm of Chaos very much played upon this. So that was the Great Summer Campaign that we mentioned before. And in the Storm of Chaos, they had a variety of special troops that were using hooks that they could fly up on massive chains to pull themselves up. Special mutant wall scaling nasties. The Flarekin, exactly. And they were proper daft. But as is often the case with special rules for special campaigns, they come out with some pretty crazy stuff that they can do. But there is some beautiful art in the Storm of Chaos book, including the Ulric Thunder piece of art, also including a really nice one with a Greater Demon of Slanesh making its way up too, which is pretty nasty. Cut a long story short, Middenheim is on a massive rise of rock and rises up towards a peak and is a multi-layered city. It is a city primarily populated by humans and dwarves and a significant number of halflings with a relatively decent population of elves as well, a smattering of ogres, and you get an idea of what's there. If you go with the broader Warhammer lore and don't just stick with what's generally popped in the books, you'd probably say there's a good few hundred or more gnomes in there as well, just to give a quick nod to the new gnome team for a good old Blood Bowl. So, loosely speaking, that's what you're looking at in terms of the city itself. Let me just get rid of that bit. Hey, we're back.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like Andy said, if you read from different books, they will say a lot of very random different things that disagree with each other in interesting ways when it comes to like how Middenheim looks or is designed. Like in the Storm of Chaos book, one of the things they talk about is like you have the causeways, but then it says that instead of there being like, because in the end times they ran with the idea that there's like magic that's used to destroy parts of the causeways and stuff like that. In the Storm of Chaos, it just says that the causeways were built to a certain point, and then there are wooden bridges that connect the end of the causeways to the city, so they could just destroy them because they're made of wood, so they're easy to rebuild and destroy. So they just do it on like they're just on a regular basis, which neither of those are bad. It's just interesting different interpretations.
Yeah, and you'll find that this is often the case. For example, if we go back to the first edition of Middenheim, I'm bringing up the map that I'm currently building for my own game just now. So you can see there, good old city of Middenheim, Games Master map. Now, the reason I bring this one up is because it's based in terms of its shape on the original first edition version of the map. And in the first edition version of it, it's very much a rise of rock and it's almost flat across the top. It says, let me just get rid of that little comment there. It's flat right across the top, and there's not a great deal of variation in height. But even that was contradicted by the art for the book. The art for the City of Middenheim book, which was done by Ian Miller, was quite frankly pointy, right up to the point. And this art became iconic in that everybody that described Middenheim from that point forwards described it as a city that had layers upon layers upon layers. But every time that the roleplay game then tried to map it, they mapped it as flat. Now, this map is by its nature going to be flat in terms of how it looks because it's a 2D one, but it's a 2D one that's going to be representing something that looks like that. It's got rises, it's got falls, it's got layers. Now, the reason I bring this one up is because even though the original description of the city often described maybe tenemented buildings over across 3, 4, 5, or 6 levels, and how there might be a raise and a lower, and often it described winding streets that went quite far downhill, particularly in districts like the Wind, which is one of the districts where an awful lot of the city's industry was sited down in the southeast of the city. Nevertheless, it wasn't a spire. And when we were discussing how to do this with Games Workshop back in the day when I was planning the Middenheim book, there was a bit of how do I make this either match the art or not? And I prefer it match the art because that's what everybody knows for Middenheim. And because I was dealing with people who'd all visited Edinburgh, we all had a similar cultural touchstone. And that was in the center of Edinburgh, there's a great castle that sits on a giant rock. And there's a road that connects it all the way down to the palace, the Holyrood Palace at the bottom called the Royal Mile. And off the Royal Mile, there was old tenements that dated all the way back to the 1600s in some places. And the Royal Mile went down slopes to either side, but the tenements went out. And it meant that at some points there was up to 15, 16, 17 levels of building. And that was back in the 15 and 1600s. And we all went, that's basically Middenheim, isn't it? And we all went, yeah, it really is. It's layer upon layer. And as the rock goes down or up, it's just filled with buildings through all of its various heights. And we sat down. I was down in Bugman's Bar at the time discussing it with Games Workshop. I won't discuss who I was discussing it with. And we laid out exactly how Middenheim worked in preparation for this book. Not this book in particular, it was the Middenheim book coming out. And we built a layered version of the city with great parks, with a massive Middenball pitch on one layer and other layers having things like the palace near the back, right at the very top, looking down over all of it. And we built ourselves a version of Middenheim that made sense to the art. But that did not make sense to how it had been described previously. And that in and of itself was a potential concern. Fortunately, I didn't actually need to write that book. Somebody else did the writing and I ran away before the development was done. So how they fixed that was up to them. But to cut a long story short, we have got ourselves a pretty massive city that has been described in multiple different ways by multiple books. Broadly speaking, it is either approximately 15,000 people sitting atop a rock. That doesn't really match what Warhammer needs. Warhammer describes Middenheim as this great bastion of the north, which has a standing state army of several thousands. Now, unless most of the population is included in that standing state army, which, by the way, is often going to war elsewhere, it's nowhere near big enough. The next approximate area is about 50,000 people. This is the general population that's given by the most recent version of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It's about a quarter the level I discussed with Games Workshop when I was down there, but is a pretty good sizable city. Now we go to the second edition of Warhammer, which had a book called Ashes of Middenheim describe it, and it gave it a population that, when it was at full population, must have been at least over 100,000 folks, or nearing it, maybe 70 to 100,000 people. But that city had been devastated by the Storm of Chaos, so its population was depopulated significantly. And that gives you an idea of the sort of populations they were looking at. When I was with Games Workshop, we agreed that it was around about 200,000, and we discussed how the demographics worked all around that, for how it fed itself, how the water was piped in, how certain springs worked up, other water came along the causeway. That's the causeway over towards the east. So there was piped along with the causeway, Imperial engineering attached to the Dwarven sky bridges, which also was a cause of deep annoyance with the dwarf engineers inside the city, because they did not like it being in any way used. So we were talking, for that version of the city, about 200,000 souls in total. But you got to remember that included halflings, and halflings cram themselves into buildings. You can get yourself a good 2,000 or 3,000 inside what others would consider to be a tenement set up for maybe a few hundred humans, where they've got 2,000 or 3,000 all living in each other's pockets inside that area. So the city itself didn't need to be that large, but I will note one thing just before we move off the geography of the place, and we'll maybe keep the map in the background if we need to bring it up for another reason. There is a great sport in Middenheim. It goes by the name of Middenball. And it's 100% not Blood Bowl. It was, however, in many respects, the inspiration for Blood Bowl, because it came before. Did it come before Blood Bowl? Let me just add up time and detail. That might have actually come out just after the first edition of Blood Bowl. I had first edition of Blood Bowl set as well. It's a great game. Actually, no, it wasn't. The second edition of Blood Bowl was a great game. Let's not get caught up in details. And this single thing, which has been detailed, I detailed Middenball, which was a general game that was played across the Empire, which is a version of snotball football, where they actually rather illegally wrap a snotling up inside tethers of leather, and they throw that snotling around. And as my special rule for that game, hey, this game's got legs, applied, that snotling can wake up and run off as part of the ball, which is super fun. Hey, this game's got legs. Look at the snotling go. Yeah, I made rules for Middenball because it was super fun. Now, Middenball's got its scale laid out, and to make it fit, I had to use a pitch that was approximately this big, a very famous stadium in the center of Middenheim called the Bernabeu Stadium. And this stadium had to fit in this park. If I went with the scale of the original map, the stadium would be about that big. Can you see the
yeah, we can see it. Yeah, let
me just fill it in there. It would be approximately that large. Now, I don't know about you, but that strikes me as possibly too big, given that the stadium is meant to be inside the Great Park in the center. It's because the sport of Middenball was that had been described in later editions wasn't a very small, tight, gladiatorial style game. It was a big, proper pitched version of the game. So I had to scale up the city to accommodate it, because there are not just one pitch, there are multiple pitches for Middenball. If I go up to the north of the city, for example, and I go up to the Palace district, it's called a bit of Midder by the nobles. Would you like to play a spot of Midder? And they've got a pitch just sitting over here. Just off the palace, far cleaner, far tighter, where they can just play around. The Knights Panther, who are in this section, the Knights Panther have their great, let's say, well, it's called the Odin House Pantera, the Magnum Odin House Pantera. That's the Grand Master's personal lodge. They've got a pitch out back as well, because they use it for training purposes. as do the lower orders. If we go down here, there's one over in the Elk Quarter. You can see a pitch there in the half-made, not finished map, or another one down here, or indeed another one over in other parts of the town. It's all over the city. But if I did that, the city would basically just be pitches. There'd be no space for buildings.
We only play sports here.
Exactly. So clearly that had to change. So cut a long story short, Middenheim is a city that has been pitched at different sizes in lots of editions, and it's messy as fuck. But loosely speaking, it is always a high city with steep sides, high walls all around it, and probably a rising city in the middle, or alternatively, a flat city in the middle sitting at the back. All of the art depicts it as a rising tide of buildings, much as seen there.
The rising tide does look more epic, I will say that.
Frickin' does.
It doesn't match the myth we're about to talk about, but
yeah. So,
cool.
Having done that, why don't you move on to the good old myth?
I will as soon as we get caught up on super chats.
Oh, of course,
we've had some of those come in. Let's see. Hi, OSO6. Technically more on Ulric, but as Ulric strictures state that wearing a helmet in combat is dishonorable, does that include jousting as well?
Right. So there is a lot of chat about this. And I would love to say that the answer is simply yes or no. But behind the scenes, I have had different answers to this from different people. So the answer is, I am sadly going to say whatever is appropriate for your game and whatever is appropriate for the licensed game at the time. But having said that, you'll find that most books skirt around it because they don't want to actually state it out one way or the other, because it was considered by some to be controversial. But quite clearly, the Ulric strictures are 100% certain on this. No helmet. It restricts your hearing, it restricts your seeing, and perception is at the very heart of being an Ulrican, being able to see everything around you that a helmet stops. Now, you could argue, well, we could have some sort of helmet that, no, they just have a very simple stricture, no fucking helmets. That being the case, they would not be wearing helmets in any formal joust, and that is something that would almost certainly come with culturally different styles of jousting. And that was something that was going to be tackled in the Middenheim book when I was still running it. We were going to be having a lovely bit about how every year during the Middenheim's Great Carnival, because it hosts a massive carnival every single year, during that, the melees and the various jousting similar style competitions had a different set of rules in place because of Ulrican sensibilities. Something that visiting Reichlanders, some Middenlanders, some Hochlanders roundly laughed at, saw as almost a justification for the Middenheimers and the Middenlanders to be laughed at for their ridiculous rules. But nevertheless, just like in warfare, they do not wear helmets.
There you go. A very simple answer. Celestial Monkey Dragon, thank you for the generous cheers.
Thanks very much.
Love watching you guys talk. Been watching Sotek for years, but one question after the Malik etc. fight: how many soldiers and monsters does a Black Ark hold? Does a Black Ark have on it? Off topic, not sorry. To give you a very brief answer, the technical answer would be as many as it needs. But many. You have to remember, a Black Ark is not just like a tower or a fortress. It is a city. Like, it is a full, massive, fortified city on all the rock that it used to sit on before it broke off from Oathwan. They are colossal things. A lot of people think they're just like little castles on a hill. No. So much fucking bigger.
No, and to give you an idea of that in practice, in the Old Man of War game, your entire fleet could be stored inside it. Your entire fleet, all of them. Literally every ship you had could just sail out of the back of it because it was a city with a massive city port. And that's including ridiculous sea monsters that are as big as some Warhammer towns. Truly, truly big. Now, that doesn't mean all of them are of that extraordinary immense size, because I'm sure there's some variation. But to cut a long story short, there is a reason that the Black Arks of Nagaroth basically never really sink, except in the most extreme circumstances.
Yep. Helps when you're just a floating piece of rock. CB4N, if the water is brought in primarily by a single causeway, doesn't that make the city actually kind of vulnerable to siege? Or am I misunderstanding elements of...
You misunderstand. That's only one of the water sources. And that was the water source that I'm not even sure hit the final book. That was one that was discussed when I was down in Games Workshop. There was a great lake that sat up in the Middle Mountains, a glacial lake that fueled that particular reservoir. But there's further reservoirs, not just inside the rock itself, but beneath it, because it's a natural... Let's say it's got lots of natural springs that push their way up, and it's not just water springs. There are also magical springs that work their way through the Middenheim.
We will get into those
as well. We will be getting to those particular points. So it would be vulnerable to a degree in that you could cut a certain chunk of water, but by no means can you seal off the water without taking everything inside it.
Yeah, but it would also require you to literally go trek up into the Middle Mountains, which many of the people that siege Middenheim don't want to deal with. Still loading. Good day. Had no idea Middenball was from the land.
I'm going to presume that you're saying was from Middenheim, and the answer is yes, it is. And when we were discussing how it was going to be introduced, we actually had ourselves an entire story, which again, I don't think the final book, because I didn't write the final book, so I'm not sure what eventually got in. But the story that we built was that it was actually used as part of the diplomatic relations between the Lorelorn elves and the Teutogan tribes way back when. And the dwarves came in afterwards and also do it. And come modern Middenheim, both the dwarves and the elves claimed that they were the originators of Middenball, and the humans that were there claimed that no, they were. So there was a tripartite disagreement as to where the sport came from.
I love that so much, because that makes that hilariously close to the origins of Blood Bowl as well, where it's like a diplomatic way to deal with things.
Yeah.
That's
why we did it.
Would the dwarfs' relations with Middenheim be seen as the best compared to other cities due to Middenheimers being very honorable like dwarfs?
No.
No.
No. Not in the slightest. This is a deeply complex situation which deserves its own stream. But at its heart, Sigmar bound the tribes of humanity inside the right basin together and saved the dwarf's ass. And he was the one that was named Devonger, and the great favor that was done to the dwarves will never be repaid and is passed down through the Empire's bloodline, certainly not Middenheim's. And when we look at Middenheim, the Middenlanders, in terms of their honor, they may say they're honorable, but they are no more or less honorable than any other human as far as the dwarfs are concerned. The dwarfs have got their own very unique version of what honor is, and it is super easy for other species like humans to transgress that. So Middenlanders, for all they may view themselves as the pinnacle of honor and what is good about people, the dwarfs don't see them as any better or any worse than any others, but they do have a very long-standing relationship with the Middenheimers in Middenheim. There are various clans of dwarves that have been there pretty much since the founding of the city.
Yep, and we'll get into that as well in just a minute.
We certainly will.
Instead of Baldur's Gate 3, we should have got Middenheim. I think you mean the enemy within, but yes. Middenheim should have been a very key part of that. Oh, God, come on. One day. Somebody do it. One day. Viper Wolf, wouldn't the dwarf holds below the city help fill that massive population? Okay, let's get into it. Let's get into the actual history of Middenheim, because there's a lot to talk about.
No good to me. Let's do some history.
So, I think it's best to start with the mythological origins of the city, and then we can talk about the more grounded dwarven relationships with the city. So, depending on which version of Middenheim you read, because there are slight differences, well, maybe not so slight. There are differences, I'll just say, between the various versions of how exactly the city of Middenheim was, quote unquote, created. But most myths say something along the lines of that super long time ago, you had the pantheon of what we know as the old world gods. So, and we're talking about the old gods. So Tal, Raya, Ulric, more like that little crowd. And among this, you have Ulric and Tal, who are brothers. And they have various disagreements and various jealousies and rivalries and all the things that come with any family dynamic, but they're gods, so it's a little more extreme in a lot of cases. And depending on which version you look at, like I was reading through the Storm of Chaos version, the Storm of Chaos version, as an example, says that Ulric was upset that as being Tal's younger brother, he did not feel he was as glorified as Tal is, because Ulric is god of some more specific stuff where Tal is just kind of nature, which is a very broad dynamic to have. And Ulric was feeling kind of in his brother's shadow, and Tal noticed and was like, all right, what can I do to placate you? And Ulric said, I want something that is mine and mine alone, belongs only to me. And Tal looked around the old world and said, tell you what, you can have that mountain right there. And that mountain is yours, and you can do whatever you want with it, and it'll be your domain and your domain alone. And Ulric was like, cool, that looks like a cool place. And he went over to it, and he punched it real fucking hard and flattened the top of it. So that's why there's a flat top on Middenheim, at least according to the lore, which, like Andy said, is not represented in most of the art.
Shame.
Yeah, and that plateau is an incredibly sacred place because it's where a god's fist literally impacted the earth. And Ulric said one day, he basically proclaimed a sort of prophecy that was one day the people that worship me, the people that are important to me, will all be gathered to this place, and they will build a great city, and it will be the most awesome Ulric's land in the world, and it will stand against all the tides of everything that is ever to come. The end is the broad strokes, but it will change depending on what version you're looking at.
Yeah, so loosely speaking, this story gets retold by each writer that does it, or to make it more confusing, by each in-world author that describes it, because there's a couple of iterations inside short stories, even comics, where they tell a different version of it. And in some respects, I prefer this, because this is a myth. This is something that is mythical, and it's not just going to be retold and changed according to how one receives it, according to whichever holy book you listen to or whatever. It's something that, because human lives are so short, is inevitably going to change anyway as it passes down from hand to hand to hand to hand. Loosely, though, we have ourselves a huge chunk of rock at the end of the Middle Mountains. And originally, one presumes it was a huge volcanic plug or a spire or something similar that sat there that'd be worn away until you had the hardest of rock remaining. And at some point, depending upon which myth you go for, Ulric and Tal either have an argument, they have a bet, or they are just shagging around to see who does best. And Ulric gets this mountain either as a prize or a favor, depending again on which story you go for. Sometimes there is a fight. And sometimes there's a fight between Tal and Ulric, and literally Ulric's going for Tal. It doesn't matter what actually occurs, because the Fauschlag, the fist strike, as it's called, is where Ulric punches down and hits, or alternatively swings Blitzbeal, his giant war axe, and hits, which doesn't make much sense if you go for Fauschlag, fist strike, but regardless, and hits the top of this mountain. And when it hits, the top is sheared off. And what is left behind is this great silver flame, a gigantic silver flame that will forever burn eternal. And according to which story we go with, this was because Ulric unleashed something was inside, or alternatively, put something there by striking it, or alternatively, literally blessed the place as a holy site for his people to find, which is why he put the great flame there in the first place, so that his holy people could come from wherever they happen to be and arrive at this mountain and claim it for their own. It doesn't really matter which version of the myth you go with. What matters is Ulric hit this place hard, made a big silver flame, and that silver flame, like a lighthouse, acted as a beacon. But as we go into other various myths from the time, particularly with the eventual arrival of Ulric's chosen people, we'll get into that in just a moment. It wasn't just a great big silver flame. There was also giant, enormous white wolves that prowled around the area as if they had been either summoned by or had somehow come out of said flame. And they were scary, scary motherfuckers. There's a reason it's called the City of the White Wolf. It's because Ulric, as the god of the White Wolves, is very much cited here in terms of the center of his faith and where it will come in the future. And if you go with the myths, there were literal white wolves, giant white wolves that prowled around this area and protected it from any who were considered not to be Ulric's sacred people.
Yeah, and for those, just to be clear, for those of you curious, because the term giant wolf is used way liberally in Warhammer Fantasy and is not a helpful term at all. The White Wolves of Ulric are the big boys. Like, they are comparing like a white wolf of Ulric to say like a giant wolf that the goblins ride, which are bigger than our world's wolves, make them look like puppies. Like these things are monstrously huge for wolves. Like they are bigger than like large horses. And they will kill you even if you end up, especially if you're thinking about like the old Tutakin tribes or the tribes that came before, which we'll talk a little bit about. If you're a human, you're going to need all your buddies and some really clever tools to deal with these things, because not only are they large, they're incredibly fucking ferocious, and some of them even had kind of frosty aspects to them, where just being around them could literally, like, you know, that kind of cold where it like saps your strength because it's making your bones feel cold and you're slowing down and you're sluggish, stuff like that. That is the kind of fleshhounds are probably the most fair comparison to the white wolves of Ulric.
Ulric's fleshhounds, it's not entirely a bad idea. It's worth saying as well that white wolves it's yet another reference to Michael Moorcock. For those of you who are doing the has Andy mentioned it, Michael Moorcock ding 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 game yet? Let's take a drink, Michael Moorcock, because Elric, one of his most famous characters, was called Elric White Wolf, and this was a name that was picked up and used by many others, including The Witcher, for example. They just copied basically Elric, who was a white-faced albino, and just copied him literally. Control C, Control V. There we go. That's my new character, but let's call him a Witcher instead. Perfect. And in the same way, White Wolf as a name became the company name. For example, for White Wolf Studios, it made Vampire the Masquerade. Again, all coming from Elric. Indeed, at one point, White Wolf, the company, published Elric novels, which was super nice of them. So this is another reference to Michael Moorcock and his extraordinary influence on Warhammer.
And he brought up Moorcock. Everybody take a shot.
Yeah, I'm going to take my one as well. Here we go. Because not that I'm getting drunk on a stream or anything.
Yeah. So that's kind of the important mythical foundation. What comes up, any book you read, that's going to have it. Like if you're reading the Sigmar trilogy, or you're reading the Black Plague trilogy, or you're reading the Storm of Chaos, or you're reading the End Times, if you're reading any of that shit, they're going to bring up that myth because it's critical to why Middenheim is so important. It is I would argue it is probably the most sacred place in Warhammer Fantasy. At least in the Empire. Like it is crazy how critically important it is, because there's so much kind of faith and magic all wound up into this one mountain.
Totally. And it's also the only place that Games Workshop, through its various writings, repeatedly make clear a god did a thing and made a thing happen. And if you want the proof of that, go there and you'll see it. This isn't like, oh, Sigmar, he was born in Altdorf probably, and Sigmar did a bunch of things down there and he did a bunch of mythic acts. What's the proof of that? Well, you know, his priests, they're all kind of, you know, sort of divinely inspired. There's our proof. Yeah, all the gods do that. Where's the big difference? This is different. The good old white flame, the eternal flame of Ulric that just will never go out, is a manifestation of divine will upon the Empire's very material soil. And it's that where we hit the next stage of our myth, which is the arrival of the Teutogens or the Teutognans, depending upon which version of the spelling we go for, which, by the way, is in-game spelt more than one way on purpose, because some scholars believe it should be spelt one way over another way. This isn't something where writers have accidentally made spelling mistakes. They have quite literally purposefully chosen to spell it in more than one way, because time has eroded any sort of thing that comes close to a spelling. But to sum up, the next step of the myth is the arrival of the Teutogens. And let's just sum it up in almost mythical terms and also explain what it means. The Teutogens were one of the tribes of the north. Let's just not even pretend that they were anything else. It's quite clearly stated in more than one places. They are much like the Gospodars. They came from the north. And as it's described in one of the many myths, they spilled over the World's Edge Mountains to arrive in the Great Reich Basin, as in all the water that drains out towards the River Reich. That's all of Kislev, that's all of what is the Empire, right down into the wasteland, the Great Reich Basin, which they named Ulric's Sacred Hunting Grounds. As far as they were concerned, this was where Ulric lived, and Ulric was already their god. Some myths claim that he is not their god yet and won't be until they arrive at Middenheim, but most say he was already their god, and they, as it's described there, spilled down the World's Edge mountain like blood lit free from a wound. And they massacred anything that crossed their path. Think of them like Chaos Marauders, but fucking worse. They tore across. They tore across what was Kislev, what will be the Empire, approximately 1,000 years before the arrival of Sigmar. And they basically stomped around there, being the most warlike of all the tribes that lived in this great basin, and also being the most bloody-minded as well, all at once. Known for being exceedingly tall, exceedingly powerful, and freaking rock hard. Eventually, cut all of their various wanderings down to where they eventually end up. Because in the heart of Ulric's sacred hunting grounds is, as we all know, the Fauschlag, Ulricsburg, the future site of Middenheim. And having pursued signs for uncounted generations, they eventually arrive at the foot of the Ulricsburg, where the great white wolves are howling, and at the top, the eternal flame is burning, casting silvery light across the night. And this is where the Teutogens eventually settle, until eventually, again, depending upon which story we go for, they find their way up towards the top, and they site their first fortification up there. But almost all of the myths also include the inclusion of the dwarves.
Yes, but before we talk about dwarves, we're going to get caught up on
Super Chats.
Yep. Let's see. What do you guys think about Barbracos's original story? Do you think does he have to do with the founding of the city?
Right. So, Barbracos is a story that has popped up again and again and again. Indeed, we were even considering doing a version of it for Middenheim, and a sort of version sort of slipped into production at that point too. And this isn't really a Barbracos stream, so I won't go into the details of it, but I will say that we purposefully decided he was not to do with the founding of the city. You could, of course, take your own direction with that if you wish to do so.
There you go. Vibrant Wolf, if it's not that special, I know a god whose green foot smashes the ground all the time.
Yeah, but that's a spell. And all of the gods have got spells, for want of a better description. All of them do this. And I do think it's worth pointing out the difference here was no intervention by a shaman, by a wizard, by anything else. This was a god that was walking the material plane that did something and left permanent mark of its doing. You could argue that there is only really one other site in the Warhammer world which is frequently at least provided with some similar weight, and that's the Flame of Azurin over in Ulthuan. But beyond that, it's an iffy process to try and figure out which holy sites actually are holy because of the god doing something and not because of its worshippers doing something there instead.
Yeah, if you go back and check out our Lady of the Lake stream or our Myrmidia stream, you'll note that one thing me and Andy talk about a lot is that typically it's very against the rules for gods to do things of their own volition. Normally they have to be invoked in some way. This is one of those situations where Ulric, from everything we understand, broke the rules, which is a big deal, like huge deal. It's major. Ryan Woodall, what are the chances of the Empire getting white wolves as a monstrous unit in Total War? Wishful thinking. I would say that's probably wishful thinking. I think there's a very good chance they get Warhounds from the Storm of Chaos roster, but those would be like a Chaos Warhound unit, but with Empire dogs.
Yeah, I did that unit actually from my Warhammer army. My Warhammer Middenheim army, I just used them as a replacement for Demogryphs. And I had white wolves on big, massive fuck off wolves because it was just too cool. It was too cool not to do. And I just used the Demogryph rules for them so that we had something that was legal by the game, but it was far more Middenheim themed. So I see no reason why you couldn't at least give it a go if you wanted to,
you know what?
or give it a mod.
Yeah, that would make a really kick-ass Regiment of Renown, CA, if you're listening, where like a demigryph unit, but they're riding on white wolves. That'd be so badass. Love the content, guys. You're the best source of Warhammer content. Oh, we appreciate that.
Oh, thanks very much. Do share the word. Do tell everybody else.
Yeah, make people watch us.
Yeah.
I came in partway through. Is a Black Ark washed up against Middenheim? Man, that would be an interesting story, but no. How did this come here?
Almost certainly pop up in one of our Who Will Win.
Yeah, I'm sure. So let's talk about dwarves and the Fauschlag. So this actually gives me a good opportunity to ask Andy a question, because I've seen this written different ways across different stories. I'm sure many people have and could use some explanation. So for those that have ever read about Middenheim, one of the things that's well known about the Fauschlag or the Ulricsburg is that it's got a bunch of tunnels through it. Yeah. And some books, like if you look at the Black Plague trilogy, they go so far as to say there's an entire dwarf hold beneath Middenheim within the Fauschlag. Some only say tunnels, but there are other stories, like if you're reading the Storm of Chaos book, and I think it's mentioned in the Sigmar book, that, oh, no, there were some Ulricans who dug their way up. And that was like the original way they got up to the actual plateau, was that you had like King Arthur or some other individual who quite literally dug a series of tunnels all the way up. And that those are the tunnels we have nowadays, where later stories said, no. It was actually, there were dwarfs that did it. And they even had an entire hold that was established beneath the humans of the city, which is not unprecedented. So Andy, could you smooth out some of those grains, perhaps?
Yeah, so this is a tough one, because conflicting stories again, which is deeply annoying for those of us who like to try and come up with answers. I had an answer, and I will quite clearly and underline this. It was an answer, not the answer, that I laid out when I was producing the Middenheim material. And it was an answer that was accepted at the time, because we had to try and drag together different bits of the lore. Because, for example, the Dwarf Army list made it quite clear that there was literally no holds at all in the Middle Mountains, written in black and white. And we were in a difficult place there, because there was other sources that had holds in the bloody Middle Mountains. And the good old Fauschlag is right on the very edge. It's like the tip, the western tip of the Middle Mountains, the last primary peak. And we were then left with some very vague language, which said that there was some trading points within the Middle Mountains that definitely did exist, and were the size potentially of holds. And we used that very loose language to massage in some holds, because we needed holds there to make sense not only of the plot for the Horned Rat as it was being written at that point, but we also needed it to make sense of a host of material that placed old fallen halls in the Middle Mountains that had then been the dwarves, which became the primary dwarf population of Middenheim later, who were then making expeditions from Middenheim once every other generation or so to try and reclaim their lost halls in the Middle Mountains. So what was the answer we arrived at, and how does that compare with the lore as it's been presented in various books? The answer we arrived at is that come the time of the arrival of the Teutigans in the area, the Dwarven holds had already fallen. They're gone. The great trading points that were there are gone. The mountains are held by a combination of various terrible species who have controlled this area for some time. The dwarves clans that were part of that were encamped in and around the Middle Mountains in various communities, but not the best fortified ones, as dwarves would consider it, largely because they were temporary camps. So think of them the equivalent of the best fortress that the Empire has ever made. So that's loosely where they are. When the Teutigans arrive at their great holy mountain, was there dwarf tunnels or anything else there already? The answer that we arrived at was not just yes, but definitely yes, because it was part of the Carachancore originally, but that it had probably fallen. And it had been emptied out, and it was considered, for one reason or another, not to be dwarfy. And we had let's say we had a long discussion about why the dwarfs did not like it. And ultimately, it was because the place was so freaking magical. It was something that they would go to. And indeed, we had a primary forge based near the base of it, which was used to try and channel the magic through runes, and a single rune master had been using for a good 400 or 500 years. So there was definitely that, at least with our iteration of what we were deciding at the time. And there was a lot of old tunnels, but there was also a lot of nastier tunnels, particularly with Skaven, who had infiltrated the area and were basically gnawing at the roots of it, trying to figure out what the freak it was, aware that the place was magically alive, but also terrified of it because of the enormous amount of gur that was running through it. Now, gur is that wild, cold magic, the amber magic that inspires the beast magic, as we all know. And it was very closely tied through to Ulric as well, and that great flame that was burning away at the top. So the Skaven weren't riddled through the Ulricsburg at this point, but they were in it, and they were terrified of it, but equally absolutely convinced they could use it for something because they're Skaven. So they're there gnawing away, doing their thing, which is when the Teutigans arrive. They want to get up there, and in the version that we made, they fought their way through to the top using dwarf tunnels rather than using dwarf guides, because it was important that the Teutigans had it for themselves. As a story, it made a better one, rather than relying upon others, allowing them to build their first fortifications and then allowing them to reach out and make allies with the dwarfs. And in turn, the elves, realizing that the Ulricsburg had been taken, reaching out from the Laurelorn and equally making their own diplomatic efforts to try and contain this exceedingly warlike crowd that had just ensconced itself on the edge of the Middle Mountains and had decided they were going nowhere. And that is the political situation that Sigmar then walks into. A lovely mixture of elves, dwarves, and humans all in one location. And whenever someone else arrives, the elves melt away into the forest, as they are wont to do, and the dwarves are like, yeah, well, right.
Yeah. So a couple of things I want to add on to that, that I just find interesting. I like that version of the story the most because I think it's the most heavily supported by other things that have been written. Whereas, like, a couple of important things to keep in mind when you're looking at the state of Middenheim, as Andy said, when the Teutigans arrive, is this is post the War of Vengeance. And one of the most dramatic results of the War of Vengeance is that while the dwarfs did successfully win the war, they basically lost any of the holds that were not part of the World's Edge Mountains, because there were these things called dragons, and they were a big bitch to deal with for the dwarves. There used to be like a whole group of dwarves called the Scaranawi, who were the dwarves that lived out in like more open lands. They got completely obliterated. The Middle Mountains would have been completely isolated. And then you get, the Age of Woe with the Goblin Wars and then the Troll Wars. And it stands to reason that those dwarves, isolated as they would have been, if they weren't killed by the elves, which is extremely possible, then they would have been killed by everything that came afterwards. So there's that point, which is really important to point out. The other is that it is critical that there needs to be a labyrinthine amount of tunnels within the Fauschlag, because the whole thing is that the humans don't know it. Like, they don't go down there very much because it's spooky and it's really, really hard to navigate because there are so many tunnels, which to me speaks much more that it was occupied by dwarfs. Because if it had just been humans making tunnels to get to the plateau and back down, and that's it until they finish the causeways, they wouldn't have made that many tunnels. It would have been a really simple process, and they would have realized the Skaven problem pretty quick, because all of a sudden a small handful of legacy tunnels would have been like all over the place. But when you're dealing with like an abandoned dwarf hold, you're talking about thousands of tunnels that from a dwarf perspective are very reasonable, very well planned out, expertly designed, but from a human perspective are going to be a nightmare, and they're all going to look the same. And it's going to be very difficult to navigate. And that's before we get into some of the magical stuff we'll talk about. Because the Skaven coming up from underneath the Fauschlag and using the tunnels to their own advantage is a very, very key plot point during the Black Plague crisis.
It is.
And it's also a very critical point during both stages of the Battle of Middenheim during the end times. So you have to have a big enough set of tunnels to work with that are pre-established that the Skaven are able to use them to advantage in their thousands upon thousands upon thousands, which means there needs to be a giant amount of space down there. So I think the idea that it's like, oh, the Teutigans dug up some tunnels and that was it. Ridiculous.
No, and I agree as well. The this was directly what was discussed, the ridiculous nature of some of the tales and how they made great myths, but they didn't make a lot of sense for something that happened in reality. And it was essential that the place was already riddled with a labyrinthine set of corridors, which were largely abandoned, except for various horrors that might lie down there, but not an established population. The Skaven weren't there because they were right underneath it, terrified of the place. The dwarves weren't there because literally they had no interest in the place and had abandoned it long ago for their own personal reasons, which we didn't really elucidate beyond it was magical and weirdo, right? And we left a couple of runesmiths that had been in place and had ported themselves out. So we had ourselves a place that Ulric claimed it was empty, and the only thing that were there were really terrifying monsters for the Teutigans to prove themselves against so that they could then claim it in the name of Ulric, which in turn they did.
Yeah. So, Sigmar time.
Sigmar time!
This is a really fun set of stories involving Middenheim. So the first one that's important, this is another one of those stories that has different versions depending on which one you're reading, because you have like the Black Library novels by Graham McNeil, which in the Black Library novels, what it boils down to is that Sigmar has started off on his quest to unite all the tribes. And some of them are more difficult than others. Mainly the Teutigans are a bitch. They want nothing to do with Sigmar. They hate him. Sigmar's tribe, the Unberigans and the Teutigans, not on great terms, have really never been on great terms, because they're both badasses and they do what two barbarian badasses inevitably do, which is kill each other, and it's bitter. And at the time that Sigmar takes over his tribe after his father passed away, it's King Arthur, correct?
Arthur,
and he's a piece of work. He had some issues. He's kind of one of those kings that when he was young was awesome, but as he got older, it's kind of implied he got more bitter, and he was kind of like, when you're dealing with barbarian kings, there's like the noble barbarian king with Sigmar, then there's the other kind, and Archer kind of turned into the other kind. Where granted, depending on what story you look at, there's actually some hilarious stories from the Middenheim perspective where they do not see it that way at all.
They do not.
And but in the Black Library story, which granted one version of the story, there's a kind of a hilarious thing where Sigmar wants to deal with King Arthur, and he doesn't want a war against all the Teutigans because he knows it's going to be too bloody. If they try and fight all of them, he can't siege Middenheim. It's just not possible. And he also doesn't want a big war because there are greenskins coming, and he needs to unite everyone now. So what does Sigmar do? He climbs the Fauschlag.
There's a small detail first, because Sigmar, it's an important detail for what happens afterwards in terms of the Sigmar. No, in terms of the Ulricans, and that is that Sigmar first challenges him from the base. Yeah. From the base of the Fauschlag, he challenges the king to one-on-one combat so that he can basically take over his tribe. And strangely enough, Arthur, sitting on top of the Fauschlag, looks down and goes, "Yeah, no, that is good old swearing in Ulrican terms. Fuck off." As he just sat there going, "No, I have no interest at all." And the reason that's key is because Ulricans are all about honor and one-on-one combat. And the fact that he turns this down is what gives the Teutigans as a whole the reason for thinking that Sigmar was a good person to win. It is, however, massively contradicted by other stories.
Yeah. So somehow or another, Sigmar gets up on top of the Fauschlag, and in the Black Library book, he literally just climbs it, which is fucking ridiculous. But like that, it's so big, and he's just like, fuck it, I'll just climb with my hammer. But in other versions, he gets up other ways. But somehow, some way, he gets on top. He tracks down Archer. They fight, and Galmaraz does what Galmaraz does best, and it's
not quite. It's actually, if anything, slightly more epic. The pair of them go toe to toe, and Archer's got this big fuck off giant icy sword, and Sigmar's got Galmaraz, and he's having his ass handed to him, but he passes through the silver flame. Ulric's personal silver flame somehow survives, is empowered by it, then kicks Arthur's ass. So you've got that whole passing through the flame part, and this is something that will come up in all versions of the story. Sigmar arrives up at the top and has a big fight, which he's probably on the losing side of until he is effectively blessed by Ulric himself. And it might some could argue becomes like an Aryan over with the elves, almost becomes a living embodiment of Ulric on Earth and becomes the kick-ass machine that we all come to know and love at a later date.
Yeah, the passing through the flame is a critical aspect of the story. So Archer dies as he deserved. And at this point, Sigmar rallies the people together and he goes off and does Sigmar-y things.
I will add.
Yeah, I was going to say
there is worth adding because we do have a few. There is a few contradictory tales here, and several of the tales Archer doesn't die. In several of the tales, Archer summons him to the top and says, "You come up here and we'll have our fight." The version that's popped up in Sigmar Heldenhammer the novels is very Sigmar-centric and making Sigmar the hero and everyone else the villain, so to speak. Where from the Ulrican perspective, they often cast Archer as the hero of this particular piece, realizing that Sigmar was blessed by Ulric. He effectively allows himself to be beaten and backs down. The novels massively contradict lots of points of existing lore at that point and rewrite it in very many different ways. The core of it, though, is that the Teutigans agree that Sigmar can lead them, or they agree that they will go with Sigmar to the Battle of Blackfire Pass with Sigmar at the top. According to some legends, Sigmar literally installs his best mate as clan chief. According to other legends, Archer continues on, and then it's his son who will take over. It really doesn't matter the true nature of what did happen beyond regardless of which story you go with, Teutigans, those who are pure-blooded of the clan Teutigan, rule Middenheim pretty much from this point forward.
Yeah. I do think it'd be worth bringing up kind of the hilarious, some of the Teutigans believe in a myth about the return of King Arthur, which is not flattering to the Sigmarites. It is quite literally our team's going to come back one day and he's going to kick all your asses like he should have done 2,500 years ago and be king again. And we're going to have our independence.
And if you're looking at the whole King Arthur myths, which this is clearly drawing upon, Pendrag, much like Arthur Pendragon, Pendrag is the one who is given Middenheim. Basically, he's one of the sword brothers of Sigmar. He's given Middenheim. He's like, there you go.
Badass. I love
he's also an Emberigan. So the chances of the Teutigans accepting him as king are almost nil. It makes the whole story lack a certain level of credibility, regardless of how freaking cool the whole story is as a whole.
We love him. He probably wasn't in that particular job, but we do love Pendrag.
We particularly love him as well. He's the first to ever bear a rune fang, which is worth noting as well.
Yeah, I think this might be a good point to talk about an important role within Middenheim, if you want to expand on it, Andy, which is it the Eternal Warrior?
The Eternal Champion.
Yes, Eternal Champion.
Yeah, really the Eternal Champion. Yeah, the good old Eternal Champion. I don't know what I want to say in this one. There's so many different tales in this one too. I wasn't ready for the Eternal Champion. That's thrown me off for a second. Give me. I want to jump on that.
I'll do this. I'll do this. The reason he's important is because we're going to come. Middenheim, much like it keeps doing in more modern lore, has a second flare-up of importance in Sigmar's time. Honestly, it probably had more than just one, but the one that we see expanded on is that if you're reading through like the Sigmar trilogy, for instance, it features very, very heavily in the second novel in the series because it centers as the defense against a chaos invasion, where the Eternal Warrior Eternal Champion plays a very, very big role. But because when Sigmar goes off and he gathers the Teutigans and everybody goes off and fight the Greenskins, everything goes great. And they come back. We get the first Chaos Invasion, which is not Morcar the Uniter. This is well before Morcar. This is more accurately kind of the first big Norscan invasion of Sigmar's empire, but very critically, it has a traitor amongst its ranks, which is good old nasty. Oh my gosh, I just blanked on his name.
Which one?
The Slaanesh Demon Prince, Sigmar's buddy.
Oh, Azazel.
Yes, yeah, there we go. Yeah,
from Varian.
Yes. Azazel, granted, this is before he's Demon Prince. He's merely a champion of Slaanesh at this point. And this big old Norscan invasion comes down. It's an ugly war. And eventually builds up to the big siege of Middenheim. And this is a hell of a battle. And the climax of the battle, which is a very important thing for Sigmar's legend, at least this version of Sigmar's legend, is that in the big climax of the battle, the Norscan warlord gets kind of tricked and put through a ritual that allows his body to become a portal for a bloodthirster of Khorne. And a big old scary ass greater demon bursts out of his body and attacks Middenheim, and it is bad for the defenders. Because normally demons, one of the really interesting properties of Middenheim is that the Flame of Ulric makes chaos creatures tend to have a difficult time getting into the city. They have a hard time manifesting within it, almost as if Ulric himself is keeping them out, warding them away. If you're ever reading like the Storm of Chaos storyline or the End Time storyline, one of the critical things is that the Flame of Ulric makes it that the city is borderline impossible for the forces of chaos to properly assault, because it literally is warding them off. But in this fight, the Bloodthirster does manage to get into the city and is going after Sigmar, and their fight ends up taking place within the Temple of Ulric itself, where you have this big showdown between Sigmar and the Bloodthirster, where Sigmar gets his ass handed to him pretty thoroughly. But fortunately for him, there's a big moment in the battle where he manages, either by getting the flames onto Galmaraz or just getting lucky and hitting the Bloodthirster. Somehow the Bloodthirster gets the Flame of Ulric on him. And the moment that happens, it's fucking game over. It starts going up big time. Though the Flame of Ulric, which we're going to talk about more in depth here in just a minute, is a cold flame, not a hot flame. And it slows down the Bloodthirster enough that it literally allows Sigmar to beat it to death, which is a pretty big accomplishment, especially because he's not God Sigmar yet. He's just Sigmar. And the Eternal Champion, though, does play a key role in this story because he defeats Azazel. Actually, no, I think Azazel kills him, if I remember.
I can't quite remember this tale, which is why I was like, oh, pass on that one, because it's Mercer, I think, who's the one who's marked as him, but I can't remember was it because it wasn't Pendrag. Oh no, gosh, I think you're right.
It started with an M. I'm pretty sure.
I think it's right. Mercer. I'm pretty sure it's Mercer. I should go check it up. I'm pretty sure it's Mercer, who was marked as, in that novel, the first Eternal Champion. And the reason why I was stumbling over it a little bit is because I was trying to hook that through, and I'd forgotten the Mercer part of it, because the Eternal Champion, or the Knight Eternal, depending on which one you go for, and again, it's another Michael Moorcock reference for anyone who knows that the Eternal Champion is his core character throughout all of his novels. So the Knight Eternal is given the position, an almost ceremonial position, to defend the city. And there are lots of different myths from where he came from, including the new myth that was added, it was ages ago now, by Graham McNeill in the Sigmar trilogy, with, I'm pretty sure it was Mercer who was declared as the first one. My memory of it's so poor. But again, as I recall, originally the title was either installed by a witch who advised one of the Grafs in the past that they would need a great defender for the city, or alternatively, a great defender just arose from nowhere. You're going to check it up. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Fucking me. It's actually fucking me. So a great defender would be needed by the city. So the position was created by one of the Grafs to effectively just show how important Middenheim was. But effectively, this man or woman is a symbol of the city of Middenheim and its defense, the Knight Eternal. And this Knight Eternal, according to some legends, literally got magical armor that manifested out of the Silver Flame of Ulric. In one story, it literally walks out of the Silver Flame of Ulric to be worn by the first Knight Eternal. And given that clearly isn't going to be the case if you run by the original Sigmar version of this tale, where there was no magical armor described in there walking out, there's going to be clearly some contradictions. But loosely, we have the Knight Eternal, who is the defender of Middenheim and who wears this gleaming white armor of purity, and in many respects symbolizing the white flame itself. Come modern times, the Knight Eternal is either A, if you go with the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay version, a somewhat pathetic figure in comparison to what you'd expect for Warhammer, in that he's not that impressive. But if you go with any Warhammer version at all, he's the biggest, most kicky-assest character you ever have seen. A literal manifestation of Ulric and the great tower of rock that Middenheim is on. A bastion, a protector, and someone who you really do not want to be crossing swords with. So yeah, there you go. There's your Knight Eternal.
Yeah, okay. I'm pretty sure it's Mursa.
I'm pretty sure it's Mursa too. If anyone out there who's read the books recently,
yeah, it is, because I think, if I recall correctly, I think it's Mursa, because Pendrag dies in this story, and then Mursa takes over as the new count.
Yeah, he basically becomes the champion of the Teutigans or some nonsense like that, and then later on that becomes the Knight Eternal or something like that. But he does end up becoming the Electra count effectively after Sigmar's done his deed. So, what will we move on to next?
So now I think would be a good time to get caught up on super chats and stuff, actually. So let me do that real quick, and then we're going to talk about the silver flame, or the white flame.
The silver flame.
Let's see. We already did those. We did that. We did that. We did that. Here's a traditional Ulric enchant based off the god of winter, wolves, and war's own words. Take me back, Quayin. I can't raise our children alone. Don't leave me. Let's see. Came in partway through. Oh no, we already did that one. Yep.
Yeah, we did.
Yep. Okay. Good. That means I'm where I'm meant to be. Yeah. Which, make sure to check out our last Lorebeards stream that we did on the Shadows of Change stuff over on Andy's channel for some more interesting discussion about the silver flame.
Yeah.
Eternal champion. More cock alert. Yep. Take another shot.
So right, Mornington.
Yep. Do you think we will see a Knight Eternal appear in Total War? It's possible.
If they did a Middenheim faction.
Yeah, it does get brought up in the Storm of Chaos book, so it wouldn't surprise me.
Totally.
So the Silver Flame. I think this is a good moment. We've touched on it a few times. I think this is probably a good moment to really dive into it. So this is a more complicated topic than it may initially appear, because there's a lot of bonus and conflicting information that kind of shows up on this thing. The general gist, before we get into some more end times related shenanigans, is that there is, of course, the legendary Silver Flame, which modern in like 8th edition modernish day is held within the Temple of Ulric itself. So if you went to the temple, you'd go inside to visit, and you see the glorious Silver Flame, which burns cold, like freakishly cold.
I will add to that, though, that some writers forget that and they say it's hot. So do be aware, if you're out there reading some of the more obscure lore corners, you might find a couple of them say, and it's hot, but really,
they're wrong.
This isn't the god of hot flame. This is the god of winter.
Yep. And it kind of follows the rules of Assurance Flame, in the sense that, generally speaking, if you touch it and you're not worthy, you're going to die. And it's probably not going to be a nice death. It's going to be painful and bad. So now what's interesting about it is that there is a lot of debate before the end times. There is a lot of suggestion that it may not be the true Flame of Ulric, but just the top little bit of it, but that the actual core of the flame may be hidden somewhere further down, deep within the Fauschlag, which of course turns out to be true. But before we get into the actual portions, Andy, do you have anything to add on like the tippy top part of the flame that's actually up in the temple?
Yeah, I'll add a few details that are worth mentioning. So we've got ourselves this great big silver argent flame that can be seen by any that enter into the temple. And don't think of this temple as a small building. It's freakishly large, and is effectively an enormous fortress inside the fortress that is already Middenheim. And this flame is always tended. Now, if you know anything about the cult of Ulric, every single major temple of Ulric also holds an eternal flame in reverence to this original. And it's nothing more than a normal fire under most circumstances, that's tended by various initiates. This is, as discussed, absolutely freezing, and anyone is allowed access to it, except for maybe a couple of folks that the Elricans would rather keep out. It's a common place to go a little bit darker for people who have reached a very difficult point in their life to just enter into the flame and disappear, never to return again. It is a place that some of the old will go to because they're in too much pain. It is a place that people who have dedicated their life to one way or another, upon realizing that their only option they have left is to do this, go and try to speak to Ulric. There are some warriors who believe that this is the only true entry point into Ulric's sacred hunting grounds, and that to pass through this flame is to go into Ulric's afterlife, for want of a better description. So many older white wolves will have big parties and then just walk into it, never to be seen again. And they are believed to pass over into Ulric's holy hunting grounds, possibly to come back as maybe a sacred white wolf, because they are, after all, the Knights of the White Wolf. That's some uses and some ways that this flame has been, let's say, worshipped. But there are at least two, if not more, who have passed through the flame and survived. The first is Sigmar. Some believe that this is possibly what deified him. Possibly the point where he became an actual god. Before that, he was just a kick-ass king with a giant hammer. After that, he was a god king. He had moved beyond the realms of mortality into something different. And the second is Magnus the Pious. Now, Magnus the Pious, we've alighted upon in various streams. Extremely short version is approximately 212 years before the world goes end times and goes boom, there was a great incursion of chaos. And Magnus the Pious bound the empire together like Sigmar had bound the empire beforehand, and marched his way up to Kislev and kicked ass and chewed gum and brought that particular incursion of chaos to an end. Part of that process was arriving in Middenheim and proving that he had the favor of the gods. And to prove that, he passed through the silver flame in Middenheim, came out the other side and said, go on then, you wolf emperors, because it was the wolf emperors at this time that ruled in Middenheim. Hey, you wolf emperors, don't you think you should do what I say? And they went, yeah, fair enough. Good point. Yep. Nope. I mean, if Ulric himself is saying aye, who the hell are we to say nay to that? So he marches off with the Middenheimers and indeed the entirety of the Wolf Emperor's forces in support. And this is something that will almost certainly be a key component of the old world storyline, assuming they reach the point of the Great Incursion of Chaos around about 2300, 2301, 2302, when it all goes boom. So Magnus is the second to have passed through it. Now, is there space for others to have done so in the intervening 2,300 years? Absolutely. Absolutely. We're not saying that means only two have done it. It's very likely, because some myths hint at it, that Arthur did it. And Arthur was told he was basically not the chosen one of Ulric. Sigmar came along afterwards, and he was, which is an Ulrican story and also supports Arthur backing down from Sigmar, depending upon how we view it. There's various hints at important Ulrics. Ulrics are the head of the cult of Ulric, who may or may not have possibly passed through it. But we don't have any confirmed tale that it has ever happened outside of, rather interestingly, two Sigmarites.
Yeah. Which is very, very interesting. It's like you figure there surely there's been some eternal champion or elector count.
Yeah, please
done it at some point. But so that's the public version of the flame. That's the version of the flame that, to put it more simply, the humans know about. But as we noted a little bit earlier, that there is actually a deeper part of the flame, like an actual core to it that is far, far beneath. Maybe even deeper than the Fauschlag into the actual earth itself. It's so deep down that supposedly nobody knows where it is. There are a lot of hints to it on a lot of the various like RPG books that have been released about Middenheim that give you little like adventure hooks if you want to have a really crazy adventure of parties trying to stumble upon it or find it. But as Andy mentioned earlier, there's a problem, which is that the flame, to put it simply, is kind of like one of the most powerful sources of gur on the face of the earth. It is like the place where the beast wind comes from, which is one of the things that's super interesting about that. Is you would think that wouldn't be the case because Middenheim is a city. It is a place where there's a lot of civilization and humanity has pushed back the wilds, which normally repels Gur. Like, for instance, one of the things with like the colleges of magic in Altdorf is that the beast wizards don't like the city of Altdorf, which is why in the good versions of the lore, their college is outside of the city's walls.
The Amber Hills, down to the south of the city.
But the Silver Flame is so horrendously powerful that despite the fact that there is a fairly populous city sitting on top of it, it is still an oppressive amount of beast magic. And as you get closer and closer to the core of it, you're probably going to find big, scary fucking beasts because they're drawn to it. Because magic like attracts like when it comes to magic, where if you're dealing with the Wind of Beasts, not only is it drawn to bestial things, but bestial things are drawn to it. And the Warhammer world follows the logic of pretty much every fantasy universe, going all the way back to Tolkien and probably even before, where if you go down deep into the dark, unexplored places, there's some creepy, huge fucking things down there. Most notably, in recent iterations of the lore, after the creation of the Monstrous Arcanum, one of the things that has been very consistent, which is awesome to see, is that there is a bloody Hydesman that lives down there. Because there is, which for those that don't know, is the incarnate elemental of Gur. There is so much magic that an incarnate elemental is able to permanently manifest down near the flame and essentially guards it. Which is why the Skaven don't go anywhere fucking near it, because there's the ultimate super predator guarding it at all times.
So you might think, how does that marry with the story that I mentioned earlier about the Skaven and the dwarves and everything else? It marries because I made that particular part of the story up. The whole source of Gur being here was a part that I added to the Middenheim book when I was in the production part, and through discussion with the author that I'd hired to put in place for that book, we discussed the bloody Heinzman that was down at the bottom, exactly what it was and why it was this way, and was there other versions of this elsewhere in the world. That didn't actually matter at this point, although that is what we were working towards. What mattered was that this was a great font of Gur. And if you wanted to try and look past the myths, then the Fast Strike Mountain wasn't so much knocking off and creating the flame, it was revealing this great strength, or alternatively, empowering it down into the earth, depending on which version of the story you would prefer to go with. To cut a long story short, though, the flame is just the top of something far deeper and something that terrifies creatures like the Skaven. It is something that the Teutogan tribe in particular were drawn to and have built around. Now, that may, as you say, stand contradictory to counterpoint, whatever, may stand against how we generally view Gur. My words fail me there. As we view Gur, but Gur, like all the winds of magic, is a complicated thing. And to simply say that it is one thing is to disregard the other things that it also is. And we also have to remember that the winds, when they rise very differently. And it is not contradictory to Middenheim existing above it. And indeed, it complements it, and it complements the nature and character of those who live there. Because to this day, the Teutogan tribe, or what is now the Middenheimers, are the most bloody, the most belligerent, and the most terrible of all the tribes. And R. Ulric himself, the R. Ulric model literally has claws as he's turning bestial. The various references for how Ulrican divine magic reference is pure savagery and bestiality as well, all sourced on this very, very divine site. You could argue, if you wish to do so, that this great font of Gur is the god itself made manifest in one fashion. You could say that Ulric is the great god of everything that is wild, is represented here as well. That would be one way of viewing it, but it certainly wouldn't be the only way. All that really matters is that we have a giant fountain point, a font, a great wellspring of Gur, and that Gur does not simply come from the gates of chaos, come north and south gate alone. It is coming from other places, much as we know the winds leak into the material world in a variety of other places in various stories as well. This is, however, as will become later the case, the most important wellspring of magic arguably in the world, which is not necessarily where I would have put it if I were writing it, but it is exactly what they did with it.
Yeah. Gary Reynolds, hey guys, great to see another Lorebeards. Now it's part of my life. It's also can you say hi to my girlfriend Joanna? Hi Joanna.
Hey Joanna, nice to see you, Joanna. Very nice.
Hope you and Gary are doing well. Sam Alden, with all the rules about no permanent divine intervention, the consequences seem very slim. Why doesn't every god do the same? You say that, and I'm going to use that as a segue here in a second to talk about the potential consequences of what Ulric did. Hoplite, fellow writer here, just wanted to highlight how spot on Andy's writing/editing comments are in these chats. Caught up late on last episode and had the same conclusion on page 1. The Kislev story needs editing. Yeah. We love him, but he needs an editor. Like, God forbid, y'all make plenty of money. Someone just give him a little helper. It's not that hard. So, consequences of Ulric's actions are, so there are a couple ways to look at this. Like Andy said, one of the theories behind the flame is that Ulric punches this mountain or does something to this mountain, and he reveals the flame. But this is one of the times where I don't like a lot of aspects of the end times. We have a big bitch stream about it. If you want to go watch it, was super fun. We'll do another one later this year.
We have another one coming later.
Yeah. One of the parts that I don't like the way they handled it, but if it were to be written differently, I like some of the ramifications of it, is that it's revealed in the end times that the god Ulric literally wound up bound deep beneath the Fauschlag Rock. He's there physically. He is not in the normal godly realms. He basically got himself stuck. And is trapped in a big icy domain at the very, 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 very bottom of the flame, which I do think is an interesting ramification of whether he did it intentionally or did it on accident, allowing his power to be so present, which is important. You know, it's given the Empire like an excellent final bastion to stand against the demons of chaos and all these other nightmarish forces that attack them, and has allowed Middenheim to quite literally save the old world on multiple occasions. But it also could theoretically be linked to that Ulric, who might have been a much broader god, a much more powerful god on a global sense, ended up localizing his power. Kind of pulling an ancient widow in a sense, where he became bound to the land and was no longer able to be a more broad deity like the rest of the gods work. That's why granted, these are purely hypotheticals. I'm just throwing ideas out. This could be why he had to draw tribes to him, like the Tudikins and stuff like that, because he no longer was allowed to play by the normal god rules.
So, to confirm the writer's intention behind that, yes, because I wrote that part about the Ulricans.
Hey!
That was actually exactly what I was writing at that time. There was clear evidence in various books that the gods had withdrawn from the mortal realms. They just had. And the gods were no longer interacting, and the best stories for those mostly came from the elves. However, Ulric has tales of not just wandering the mortal realms, but doing it frequently, impregnating people, having a chat with various individuals. So it was important that that was contextualized and understood within the newer versions of the lore that had come later, because the idea of the children of Ulric, the sons of Ulric, or whatever, that were considered to be the mortal descendants of Ulric, I didn't want to discard that when I was writing the newer Ulrican material. I wanted to keep it. So to keep those myths having some sort of sense and having some contextualization within the broader writing that had been added for the elves, for indeed the dwarves, for all the other various factions and how they handled gods, it was essential that I explained why the gods weren't there, except for Ulric. And Ulric... And Ulric, at least in the version that I was writing at the time, and almost certainly will be rewritten by another, was and is in Middenheim. He's below Middenheim. He is the very source of the Gur that is in Middenheim. If you want to view it in an Age of Sigmar way, he's Gur. If you wish to view it in that sort of way, he's basically Gur. And that is why the end times desperately want to absorb this particular part, because it is something that lies out with the realms of chaos. The realms of chaos at the moment is where all the magic loosely comes from, yet somehow there's one part that is materialized separate. It adds some form of justification for why Middenheim becomes the heart of the chaos advance. Why do they keep coming towards the Empire again and again and again? And the reason is because there is a component that they need that they cannot access because it's stuck in the material realm, and that is Ulric in many respects. That is the Gur that is frozen in place beneath there. You could even argue that there's connections to Kislev or elsewhere from this as well. So that was why the Teutogens got summoned from pretty much the other side of the world to bloodily wage war all the way there to protect him. That was the job, for them to protect that sacred flame. And that was the intention, at least at that point, for those parts of the writing. And it was also the intention for why I asked when the Middenheim was being put together, that Gur became such a core component of why the city was the way that it was, that it had a far deeper aspect to it, because without that deeper aspect, where the fuck am I going to put Ulric for the end times material? Because the end times material is pretty damn clear what's down there, so I've got to make sure that we reflect that somehow and also try to justify it in a way that provides some extra detail to the end times and tries to make it a bit cooler, in the same way that the Clone Wars were made so much cooler by all the animations. All that extra material made the movies almost bearable. So the end times material, which for me are somewhat like the prequels, they are not necessarily very good. There is no reason that we can't provide extra context to provide extra detail behind why certain events occurred. So absolutely spot on. That was the thoughts that were going on behind that. That underneath it all, Ulric is down there. And that also, that changes Middenheim as a place. It has a literal god under it. A god that is directing the state of affairs against the incursions of chaos. Sigmar passed through his flame. Magnus the Pious passed through his flame, and they were the great champions that held off the end of the world. So there's a clear connection here between what happens in Middenheim and what happens with the great cycles of chaos, moving again and again in great incursions as they come in to try and destroy the world. And that was a core component that I felt was important for the writers to not necessarily state, because this great meta stuff is not necessarily at all important for what the Middenheim book's doing, but at least justify for what it will become later in terms of the lore material.
Yeah. And the last thing that is worth mentioning deep beneath the Fauschlag, other than, you got Skaven and all this other stuff, is that one of the things they revealed in the end times, which I like, the way what they did with it was kind of but one of the things that you may be wondering as we kind of talked is, okay, why this place though? Like, why would Tull look at this and go, okay, you can have that? Why would Ulric have been drawn to this place to punch it in the first place? Like, what could be the inciting incident? Why here? And one of the potential justifications that the end times gives is that it turns out that deep, like way down there, down near where Ulric's flame is, like at the absolute bottom, there is a ton of Old One technology.
Yep.
It's basically implied there's an Old One ship, or maybe one of their work in progress. It's basically one of the gates that they were making above the North and South Pole. Wasn't quite as large by any means, but it was a similar structure. It was something that was designed to literally tear open the fabric between realities and allow the winds of magic or energy from the ether to pour through. And you could argue, granted, it's not stated this, but you could argue that may have been what drew a god like Ulric there in the first place. It may have been the inciting incident. And now this wounds into the end times, because basically, I'm going to very summarize the end times because it has some good and bad bits, and I don't want to get too caught up on it because I'd rather talk about other things involving Middenheim. But the basic breakdown is that Archaon invades the city of Middenheim. They were actually looking to hold it out fine, and then Teclis shows up, and Teclis so Old One sinks. Yeah, Teclis teleports himself to Middenheim, walks all the way down to where Ulric is at the bottom. He kind of duels Ulric, and he basically manages to trap Ulric inside of he steals Ulric's divine power. He absorbs it, takes it into his staff along with the Wind of Light, and he scampers off because he wants to use Ulric and the Wind of Light combined to resurrect Tyrion as the avatar of Hish instead of just letting him stay dead as the avatar of Cain, which would have been a way better story, but we don't have time for that. But with that gone, Ulric can't protect Middenheim anymore because his divine power is gone. So Archaon bodies the city. Like, it's not even a good siege. It is short and brutal and ugly. Archaon kills everybody. He duels Volton. It's just bad. And then later in the end time, and Ulric possesses Gregor Martark, which turns Gregor Martark into like a super wizard, which, cool, whatever, fine.
As you do.
Yeah, and then Gregor Martark dies, so Ulric possesses a different dude who's just gunning for Teclis the rest of the story. But you get, and then all the
revenge. That's what you need.
Yeah. So the Council of Incarnates, much at the very finale, they all teleport once again via Teclis to Middenheim, and you get your big epic final battle where all the Incarnates gang up on Archaon at the very center of the city, where Archaon has dug a big old pit into the city, and they went all the way down to the bottom, found this old one tech, and Archaon basically turned it on, and had a bunch of chaos sorcerers messing with it to repeat the cataclysm. At the end of it, Archaon succeeds because of betrayals and shenanigans, and a new dimensional portal to the realm of chaos is opened at the very core of Middenheim, and it causes a chain reaction that just totally fucks over everything. The end.
Yep. The end.
So let's get that out of the way. Now, like I said, the two parts I really like about it, the whole thing of Ulric being confirmed to be at the bottom, cool. The whole thing about Old One technology being there and how that might tie in, cool. Everything else, throw in the trash.
Throw it out. Yeah, so I could not agree more with this. The core concepts of what lay behind it, utterly awesome, and something that I felt was definitely worth reinforcing in any writing that was going to be attached to it. And I think that all of the justifications and beliefs that have been put forward there by Sotek are spot on, both in terms of the stuff that works and what they probably mean, and also in the stuff that bluntly kind of doesn't work, because it makes many of the characters look ridiculously stupid, childish, and petty. Which is much of my problems with the end times, which let's leave that for the next end time stream, because by the gods, I'll tear into that one.
2024 edition. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I'm just remembering it all, and it's hitting me again like a great Fauschlag Rock.
So now what I would like to distract Andy with to talk about is, I think now's we're hitting a couple of highlight points when it comes to talking about what's in Middenheim. A lot of the really cool aspects of the city. So I think one good place to start, if Andy's not too sideswiped by this, would be a discussion of who, because a lot of people ask this and are often excited by this, who are the big knightly orders within Middenheim?
All right, so there are multiple knightly orders, but there's two that are worth discussing directly. The first are the Knights of the White Wolf. The Knights of the White Wolf, in terms of knightly orders in the Empire, are almost unique in that they do not draw from the nobility. They draw from anyone who is willing to take on Ulric's many oaths. And the Knights of the White Wolf are really big as a knightly order, one of the biggest. And this is often forgotten because most people think of knights like, for example, the Rights Guard. The Rights Guard's a tiny knightly organization just outside of Altdor protecting the Emperor. The Knights of the White Wolf are across the Empire, particularly the north. And Middenheim is where they are sited. The Grand Master of the entire order works from the High Temple there. And the Knights of the White Wolf come in a variety of forms, but you'll most commonly see them for their big long beards, their massive cavalry warhammers, and either their bright red armor symbolizing lacquered, symbolizing the blood that flows free from all the wounds that they are almost certainly going to be whacking out of everybody, or alternatively some sort of polished equivalent. Sometimes they're in silver or a dusky toned one. But the companies in particular that are worth noting are the ones that are cited here, because the great order of the Knights of the White Wolf are split up into several companies of wolves, and each company has got its own master. And each one of these companies are cited in a different part of the Empire. The part that's centered around Middenheim are Blue Company. Blue Company have got their own quarters inside the Grand Temple and also have massive training grounds just outside of Middenheim as well. And Blue Company are by far the biggest company of the Knights of the White Wolf. There's literally thousands of them spread across all the temples of Middenland. Every temple in Middenland is charged to train a certain number of them, and hundreds of them can be found inside the temple. Beyond that, you also have yourself Gold Company and Silver Company, who are also cited here for different reasons. One guards the Silver Flame, the other one guards Ulric himself. So that's 3 whole companies. It's worth saying, though, that Blue Company so outnumbers both Silver and Gold. It's not even worth mentioning. They're like squads in comparison to the huge other company.
They're specialists.
Yeah, indeed. But they all come from a group called the Teutogan Guard. Or the Brotherhood of the Axe when you're dealing with the White Wolves in particular. And they are pure-blooded Teutogans because they're kind of racist. And they very much believe that they are better than everyone else. They are the chosen children of Ulric, the Teutogan Tribar. And those who have got pure Teutogan blood get access to the best equipment and inevitably the best positions as well. So we have ourselves the Knights of the White Wolf. They are the dogs of the city. Then you have the cats. And it's fair to say that the cats and the dogs do not get on. The cats in this case are one of the most famous knightly orders in the entire old world, because they are not just in the Empire.
Just in Warhammer Fantasy.
Yeah, that's Knights Panther. And one of the reasons that they're most famous because of John Blanche's Knights Panther image that he did, one of the very first images of the Knights Panther, that looked very similar to the old Napoleon image. Gorgeous picture. Anyway. The Knights Panther are the richest knightly order, and they're also secular. And there's a host of mysteries surrounding them. The most important part is that they were founded about 1,000 years ago during some of the Great Crusades down in Estalia, and then down into Araby later. And they were founded by a bunch of nobles who had managed to loot an extraordinary amount of stuff and take it back to the Empire. In particular, they were founded by a small inner group of Altdorfers. Believe it or not, the first chapter house was there, contrary to many stories which try to place it over in Talabic land or try to place it up in Midland. The first one is, at least in the knightly order source, there. And they spread out from there. Come the 1,000 years later time, they continue to hold much of the trading routes down to Araby, and they are rich from this, exceedingly rich, all of whom have got exceedingly rich armor, well inscribed, pelts over the shoulder, all panthers that they have reared or taken down from Araby.
Helmets you will ever see.
Indeed, each one of their helmets showing the craziest kill that they've managed to secure in their time. So you'll get all sorts of crazy stuff sitting on their helmets. And they are across the Empire. You'll find, for example, in let's say the Ubersreich book that we put, there's an Auden House Pantera marked in there. That's one of the old chapter houses of the Knights Panther. They're in Altdorf, they're over in Marienburg. They are pretty much everywhere. But their Grand Master is sited in Middenheim. And the Grand Master and the group that works from Middenheim all have little crowns sitting above the standard panther symbol that they use, because they are the personal bodyguard of the Graf. And there is a very big mystery as to why. Now, as I was writing it back at the time, it was meant to be a recent mystery. It was meant to be only around about 50 years old. However, when the Middenball book eventually came out, they took the idea that I gave them and they made it huge. It happened hundreds of years ago, which wasn't the plan, but whatever. Sure, let's make it that. What matters is there's a big mystery, because the Knights Panther, for one reason or another, have decided to be under the control of the Graf of Middenheim, but only the group that is found up in Middenheim. And that group is also known for its particularly heavy anti-mutant and anti-chaos attitudes. They are often found driving down into surrounding forests around Middenheim, hacking down any mutants that may be found there, attacking beastmen, and similar. This group is known to be almost as racist as the Teutogans themselves. It's also worth noting that they are largely founded of, now these days, mostly Middenheimers, where the order as a whole drags from the nobility across the empire. And they are, as already noted, they are the richest order. Only the Knights Jaguar come even close, and the Knights Jaguar are in fact just a sub-branch of the Knights Panther.
Yeah. Okay, so that is very excellent. I think another comment or question that often comes up with Middenheim that's worth addressing, because there's been some, and we talked about this back in the Grom episode, is that there's been some confusing wording in several situations of, has Middenheim ever fallen?
No.
It has successfully, if you go watch our ground stream, somehow have had the roof stolen off the most heavily guarded building at the tippy top. But like we said, probably was done by a team of wyvern experts. How did they do it? Who knows? But...
Okay, so there's multiple instances of where Middenheim falls but doesn't. One of them is Grom. And apparently Grom somehow got all the way up there to take the roofing from the High Temple of Ulric and run away with it to create his chariot. During the Vampire Wars, the place gets besieged and in one story falls. It's not considered to be a canonical story. It doesn't fall. Middenheim, like Talabheim, has never fallen. Unlike Altdorf, which kind of has in multiple places, but claims it hasn't fallen, which is slightly different. Talabheim definitely hasn't. Middenheim definitely hasn't. And let's just say that Altdorf hasn't, so it feels better about itself. Nuln equally has fallen, but Nuln has only really fallen a couple of times, one of which was famously to Grom the Paunch. Middenheim, unlike Nuln, did not fall.
Yep.
But they did lose the roof.
Yes, and they have played a major role in pretty much every single major conflict. Like the Vampire Wars, you had the whole instance where Vlad brutally murdered their big Grandmaster of the White Wolf. And for killing him, he got killed first.
Jarek.
Yeah, Jarek? I think it was. Yeah, and then Vlad killed him back and put his corpse on public display in the middle of the city as though interesting, Vlad did not siege Middenheim. One of his kiddos did.
Yeah.
Never successfully took it though.
Nope.
But some other important things that have occurred in Middenheim over the years. One of the things that's really interesting, I think, to talk about, because a lot of people don't know about it because it's hard to find mentions of, is the Middenheim's version of the College of Magic.
The Guild of Wizards. The Guild of Wizards has gone through more than one iteration. So when you had the first edition book, so we're now talking all the way back at the bridge between the 80s and the 90s, when the Enemy Within campaign was getting filled out for the first time, as we mentioned earlier in the stream, and Middenheim was discussed. They added a Guild of Wizards because that wasn't really controversial at that time. Pardon me, that wasn't controversial at that time because there was no colleges of magic as we understood it at the time they were writing it there. They didn't exist. What they were creating was a new thing. This was in Middenheim, wizardry is accepted. They have a guild. It's right beside the Collegium Theologica, which is a great university that sits inside Middenheim. And this great university was originally a theological university. They taught the tenets of Ulric, but it broadened out to be a complete university. And part of, you could almost say a wing of it, was the part that studied magic. It was seen as an academic pursuit. And these great wizards were a part of society. They were not, as was often the case elsewhere in the Empire, seen as outsiders, because Ulric didn't have that strong anti-magic feeling, which, you know, if he's the source of Gur, is perhaps not a surprise. But he didn't have a strong anti-magic feeling the same way that Sigmar did. Sigmar was like, magic, fuck that guy. No. No. And that was one of the core conflicts between the North, Middenheim being the example of that, and the South, although strictly speaking, Altdorf's not in the south, it's in the middle. But regardless, there was a key conflict there. So we've got ourselves the Guild of Magic, and they, every year during the carnival season, would perform flying demonstrations, flying through the sky, like formation fighters, because they're freaking wizards. There was a really big set of sky fires that we would do. Think of fireworks, but on acid with giant dragons flapping around as wizards are sitting there filling the skies.
I'm sure
with
every
stuff.
Sigmar in the audience is having an aneurysm.
Yeah, because this is part of Middenheim's yearly celebrations. Wizards showing just how freaking awesome they are, flying around through the sky as giant everything is being flung up like a huge picture show into it. Now, it's got a pun name because they do them around in the Great Park. If you remember the Great Park that I showed earlier, in fact, I can show you it right now.
Yeah,
why don't we show? Well, bring it up because I can do it right there. There's the Great Park right in the middle of the city. Let me just mark over here. So that's approximately center of the screen. The Great Park, you'll see there. The Bernabeu Stadium that I mentioned earlier in the stream there. And here, this big pool is called the Black Pool because it doesn't reflect light properly. There's something odd about the Black Pool. You can see down into its depths completely, and it is deep and it is dark. And the Black Pool is where everyone gathers around in great big stands and they look up at these great fireworks. And it's called the Black Pool Illuminations. Now, that, for anyone that's in the UK, will immediately make you go, oh my God. They called it what? Because somewhat famously, Blackpool has its illuminations, Blackpool being a place in England. So the Blackpool illuminations are spread around the Blackpool around here. And just if you're interested up there, you've got the great botanic gardens.
It will be eternally funny to me being an American enjoying Warhammer stuff because we take the names of everything as just that's a good name. Like just take it face value with no deeper concerns or questions. Like for people in England, it's like, oh look, that's such a good reference, and we're like, no, that's just they just came up with that, and it's a good name.
Yep. The Blackpool Illuminations. So the wizards are completely integrated into society. Now, there's various issues in the past. Through its timeline, there's wizard wars and there's problems with the local wizards. But the Grafs of Middenheim have always had and continue to have magical support. Come the founding of the Colleges of Magic, we loosely have two different versions of how this then manifests. With the Colleges of Magic down in Altdorf reaching out and saying this guild has to take a new form where it's the 8 winds of magic that are important. This is what we teach. This is the curriculum that we have, and this is how it manifests. In one version, which started around about the mid-noughties, the Colleges of Magic effectively have 2 branches up here. We have the Gold College and the Celestial College. And the Celestial College, because it's the Guild of Wizards and Alchemists, effectively. They are the wizards, and the alchemists are the Gold Wizards. And they run this college in tandem. But in other versions, all 8 colleges work through the guild up there as well. Where the Golds and the Celestials just have stronger positions. It doesn't really matter which version you go with. The important thing is that even in the post-Teclis world, this version of, let's say, Empire Magic has a host of people who are wholly accepting of them. Yes, there are witch hunters. Yes, there are bad guys that need to be pursued. But witchery is not, in and of itself, a bad thing. It has been a part of Middenland culture, Middenheim culture in particular, for uncounted centuries. It is just a part of their culture. So there is a significant difference between how Middenheim views magic, and as we move down towards Altdorf, where the colleges of freaking magic themselves are cited. But they are underneath the, let's say, watchful eye of the cult of Sigmar, who hates pretty much everything that they stand for. So you might then go, why the hell weren't the Colleges of Magic cited in Middenheim then, if it's this great source of magic? It's not. It's a great source of gur. And even then, that gur manifests and somehow burns out at the top in this weird way with the Great Flame. It's not like the city is redolent with gur and there's thousands of amber wizards here. There isn't. The source is way below, and up at the top, it's much weaker. Altdorf, by comparison, is quite literally on a central fulcrum point of the Old One network. It's quite literally a center point. All 8 winds of magic flow through that area by the very nature of the great network of stones that are spread across the world that have been tapped by the elves to create their big network that goes towards Ulthuan and siphons all the magic out with the vortex, as we know was just hacked on top of the geomantic web. And Altdorf is a central point for the geomantic web, arguably one of the reasons why so much stuff happens there. It's no great coincidence. It's the heightened mixture of magic that causes freak events to occur. So there's a reason that Altdorf is relatively special, but equally there's a reason that Middenheim's special, but it's special in quite a different way. So yeah, the colleges of their appearance here, but the Guild of Wizardry and Alchemist is quite different to how the colleges of magic manifest down in Altdorf.
Okay. So next question, which I know, I think I've seen some people ask about, but it's worth bringing up. So we talked earlier about Middenheim's sources of water, as far as like they've got like that little tunnel they built coming in from the mountains, but they also have a lot of underground sources. But what about food? What is the food? How does Middenheim supply itself that way?
It's a problem. And this is an actual problem, and is a problem we discussed multiple times when we were planning out the book before we even went out and spoke to authors, because we're now talking about 2019 when I was originally planning the Middenheim book. And one of the big questions I had was, how can it even exist? Even a population of 15,000 to 50,000 is going to require a significant amount of food. We're talking tons of food need to get into this city one way or another. How are we going to resolve this? And there's a variety of ways that we have gently resolved it, but it's not resolved because there's one big issue, and that is siege. When it comes to siege, food is going to run out, as is often the case with any castle. But this is a huge one because it has an entire population held within it. And I would argue it's the biggest reason to keep the population of Middenheim lower, to ensure that it can be fed in a realistic fashion. But the great causeways are great causeways, and they are constantly full with tons of food getting into the city through the various markets. The second Middenheim book attempted to answer how they handled siege by, and I'm going to use the map here, by claiming that, for example, the Königsgarten, which is effectively one gigantic public park that is maintained by the royal family. It's got a host of very odd locations in here. That was entirely turned over to fields during the Storm of Chaos. And it was used to apparently grow extra crops, and at a ridiculous rate, in that they were using jade wizards to help support because there was such a rise of magic anyway, you're as well to use that influx of jade wizardry. They were using that to support it. And the Great Park down in the south also had that happening around it. So a significant amount of fields, but I don't know if you know much about crops. Not enough.
Yeah,
nowhere near enough. That is proper small business.
Everyone gets one bean.
Yeah, here's your bean. Thanks very much. There was only one way to make the siege last for more than a few weeks, and that was to have magic be the response. But the Storm of Chaos siege, as it turned out, was short. It wasn't big.
Yeah, luckily.
It passed over very quickly. So the actual need for excess food wasn't required in that book, but for ours, it kind of was. So we had a big discussion. Sadly, I don't have the map for this up, but Middenheim is, as a classic, a city that is surrounded by forests on all sides. But on the Greater Empire map, that may look like the forest butts right up against Middenheim. It doesn't. There are miles upon miles of fields sitting all the way around, and also Alpine-style fields when you go across the gate over towards the east. So we're looking this gate, which connects directly through to the Middle Mountains, and there's tiered Alpine fields up there. There's an enormous lake. We were going to be doing a section in this book, which sadly didn't reach the final part, which was the surrounds of Middenheim. Not just the entire Grand Duchy itself of the Middenheim and all its land, but the actual surrounds, how it actually survives and exists as a place. That bit sadly didn't arrive in the final book. And it was going to have the big lake that was over there that supplied the great reservoir and water, and provided also for many of the buildings actual water pressure that could move up with the piping. It was a human engineering feat, not a dwarven one. That was super fun. And there was piles of fields over there as well, and fields down amongst. Plus, the city itself has no fields for cattle, sheep, any sorts of hurled animals. They were all, again, held on the outside, and they came into the great flesh markets, which are down in the Alt Market Quarter, which is here. And many of them came from the gate over towards the east and then straight down, and they were held down there where most of the meat of the market. Fishing coming down from a variety of sources, but mostly from the north over towards the north side. But loosely, it all gets carted in. And that is a major working because there are a lot of mouths to feed. Having said that, take a look at any city in the real world and how much traffic is coming into it at any one time. Middenheim's a city. This is a city of traffic. And it's the great weak point of Middenheim, is the fact that if you do besiege it and can somehow get all the way around it and stop the food coming in, you're going to starve out a lot of people. The problem is you're not going to starve out everyone. There's going to be an exceptional amount of death in there, but equally, those who survive, still going to be almost impossible to take their bloody castle.
Yeah, it's got a good defensive.
It really does.
Yep. Getting caught up on super chats real quick. Cup Coffee Times, Lorebeards Part 2. Yep, coming sometime. Gary Reynolds, how would the flame of Ulric impact surrounding beastmen like Kazrak? Also, that explains why Toddbringer went beast mode.
Yes and yes.
Yeah, there is definitely a genuine argument that beastmen are very heavily drawn to the forests around Middenheim, particularly really, really nasty ones like Kazrak, or even Gothor the Beast Lord, who wasn't that far from Middenheim because of the flame and all of the Gur magic there. And it's definitely been a pretty nasty problem for them to deal with. The beastmen around Middenheim have been particularly clever of a breed, which is not good. Very not good. The Sengemeister, what's the best place to get a decent pint in Middenheim?
Oh, there are so many good places to get a decent pint, but my favorite is the Bell and Bucket. And there's a reason that the Bell and Bucket is my favorite. It's because my mum made it. Nice. So the Bell and Bucket Inn was originally made for a role-playing game that I ran when I was 16. And my mum made it in 3D because my mum was also a role player and a gamer because, hey, I'm a legacy. I'm a Nepo baby. And not that she was in the industry.
It all makes sense now. It all makes sense.
She did it for fun. Yeah, she did it for fun. So she literally built the Bell and Bucket in 28mm scale so that I could use their miniatures, take off the top building and have them run around the inside, put on the second floor, run around on the inside. So when I planned the version of Middenheim that we're going to use in the book, I dropped the Bell and Bucket Inn in, which is, as I recall, right here where my cursor is in the middle. And the Bell and Bucket Inn is in, if I go to West Tor, which will be all the way over here, you will see the Bell and Bucket. Where is it? There it is, number 245.
There it is.
So that is the place that I recommend you go all have a pint. It's a lovely place. Very friendly. Good pints there.
The Laughing God. Oh, here's a good one. Can you explain the dichotomy of Middenheim being described as free-thinking, a more liberal, accepting city, while simultaneously the populace is often described as suspicious of outsiders or incredibly racist? How does this compare to other cities in the Empire?
There is a good question actually there, Laughing God, because people are complex, very complex. Right. I was going through the best angle for this one.
You can hear the gears turn on that one.
Yeah. The Teutigans and Ulricans in particular believe in almost a meritorious society. They don't believe in democracy. They think that that is the worst option you could possibly have. They believe in many respects that might is right in whichever field you happen to be in. And if you can outwit and be better than the other, then you deserve to hold the position, which is why when Sigmar takes over, they all go, yeah, fair enough. He beat us. That's fine. We will now follow Sigmar. It's all parsed through to how their way of thinking. They don't just think they're better than everyone else. They constantly prove it, which is why they think why others think they are racist. They don't think that they are racist. In fact, they'd say the opposite. We're not racist. We're open-minded. We're free-thinking. We let people do whatever they want to do. They have their own responsibility to do it correctly. But if you break a law, we will take you down. And they are exceedingly free-thinking. They very much believe in the individual right to do whatever that individual wishes to do. But law is there to stop the worst depredations. And further, nobody's as good as them. And they don't think that they're racist. They think that they are quite literally better than everyone else, which is how they manage to simultaneously hold both beliefs at once. Ulricans ultimately are incredibly accepting people. It's just Reichlanders are weak.
We're just objectively better.
Yeah, except for the ones that aren't. And when they're not, and they show themselves not to be, they're like, hey, this one's all right. But they kind of think that of everyone. They're extremely elitist and are also, as far as they're concerned, the elite.
Yeah, skill issue. Exactly. Yeah. If they don't like you, it's just a skill issue.
Yeah, totally.
Mornington Crescent to the tune of Muppet Babies. Nepo Babies.
Nepo Babies, they'll make your dreams come true.
So I think a good question to touch on as well. So we talked a bit earlier about dwarfs and halflings within Middenheim.
Yeah.
But we only touched on them a little bit, and I think it might be worth some closer examination of the situation with the elves in Middenheim.
Yeah, so
what their influence on the city is.
Yeah, this is a super fun one because the city of Middenheim is really, really close to the Lorelorn Forest. The Lorelorn Forest lies to the northwest of Middenheim, and it is a great tract of forest that the elves have claimed for thousands upon thousands of years. When the War of Vengeance came to an end, the elves stayed on. When all the calls were made for everyone to return to deal with the high elf, dark elf issue that was going to come, they continued to stay on. They just never left. And they have been there since time immemorial. And the Aeonir elves are hyper political. Massively so. They are you could argue, the last example of what elves were like before they split into dark elves and high elves. They worship the entire pantheon. They have no problems with the Druki. They have no problems with the Azur. They have no problems with indeed any of the other elves, whether it's Azrai or whomever. They consider themselves to just be elves. And a part of that is a deeply political situation. And they have been manipulating Middenheim since the very first day. And they have been a part of its court almost since forever, right up to the modern day, where if you have a little look at the court of Altdorf, Middenheim, and how it's presented inside, say, Power Behind the Throne, two of the most influential people at court are elves, one a master of the hunt, the other one the court minstrel, so to speak. And they're Aeonir. They, regardless of whatever character they may pretend to have, they are Aeonir. And the influence that the court has had from the Aeonir has never ended. The elves are unlike almost every other city. In fact, every other city in the Empire. They are integrated into the fabric of the city. Elves are not common, but they're common enough inside Middenheim that most don't really bat an eyelid at seeing them. When the Great Carnival comes every year, where the city is filled with people from across Middenland, Nordland, Hochland, Ostland, and beyond, coming to witness the greatest of festivals that the Empire has to offer. The place is filled with elven minstrels. It's filled with elves in a way that no other city ever really manages. Even Altdorf, that great cosmopolitan place, which has an entire section of its time put aside for the Azure, don't have as much of an integrated feel. This city integrates with the elves, unlike the other cities where they will literally enclave themselves up into a separate little society because they're high elves and they're better than you. They, as I say, the Ulricans very much, and the Tuskins, obviously, the Ulricans, the Middenheimers, however you want to put it, they are a surprisingly accepting folk, and elves are better at a lot of things. And they just accept that. They don't view it in the way that other parts of the Empire view it, with the classic, if you've ever watched any of our roleplay streams where Lorehammer, elf bullshit, elf bullshit. Okay, they don't really do that elf bullshit thing. Instead, they're impressed by it because that's them showing their skills, their capabilities. They don't just respect it, they admire it. And some of them might even chase and pursue it, where others view the elves with this almost, they are so haughty. They're like, no, they deserve to be. Because they're better. It's not haughtiness. It's simply them having the correct position that they have there. So you tend to find that the elves, because they're also more accepted, integrate a bit more. Take a look at one of the primary characters inside the Power Behind the Throne, the minstrel character. He's constantly off sleeping with humans. Constantly. Because he's an integrated part of society, and the humans themselves don't view it as something weird. And that's something to consider when you're ever presenting your version of Middenheim. Is, for all it is, really quite well, they are. They're racist. A lot of the Teutigans don't like anyone that aren't Teutigan, particularly the pure blood ones. They just think they're better, regardless of what you can do. But the city itself is much more open and much more accepting of many things that other people view isn't. I'll give another example of that just before we move on. The city watch in Middenheim is quite different to the city watch in any of the other major cities. Generally, city watches in the Warhammer world are made up by the state army. So the state army are professional soldiers, full-time professional soldiers, and they are often deployed to act as watches in various towns and cities. So you might find that the 8th Regiment of whatever are actually just watchmen. It's not the case in Middenheim. In Middenheim, they've got themselves a dedicated watch, which is drawn from the populace, and every household is meant to give over people for the watch every year, so that they come along and basically the populace polices the populace, and it actually polices them, unlike the watch elsewhere, where the watch aren't there to be policemen. They are there to ensure that the Emperor's laws aren't broken. They don't hunt down criminals. That's not their job. They're keeping the peace. Quite different in Middenheim, where they're much more like police as we understand them in a modern context. And they are made up of an equal mixture of men and women, quite unlike the state army options down the south, where women, depending on the province you're in, have more or much, much, much less significance inside each of the state institutions. But in Middenheim, completely equal, side on side, because women are simply better at handling women's issues than men are. So you need to have a woman to deal with that, because they believe that men should do men stuff and women should do women stuff, because that's what they're strong at. They're very much Ulricans to their core. So the watch is a mixture of men and women, all of whom are basically city citizens. It's a far more broader view and accepting view of how things should be handled than you'll find elsewhere in the Empire, where the watch are often nothing more than corrupt, horrible men who are employed by the city-state to be soldiers, who are often terrible soldiers at that. It's a different type of city, and it's a far more open one than you might expect.
So to springboard off that, the last subject we'll touch before we need to get into questions. So we've talked about kind of the nice, bright, shiny parts, but let's hear about the gangs of Middenheim, because they play a huge role in the enemy within storyline.
Yeah, they do. And I'll not go into it too deep given the time, and I'll also not go into it too deep given that they do play a significant part of the enemy within story. But I will say that
the summarized
yeah, I will say that the Low Kings, as they're often referred to, this is a group of criminal masterminds, if you wish, that lie behind the scenes of much of the nefarious activities of Middenheim, are an extremely powerful and competent component of the city's working. There's one phrase that I really didn't like in the current Middenheim book, because it's uplifted from the first edition of the book, and I think is worth focusing on, because the Middenheim book, the first edition, very much established a tone for Warhammer that continued and sadly got repeated, and I shall explain it. That's the concept of a thieves' guild.
Oh,
Warhammer doesn't have thieves' guilds because thieves' guilds don't exist. They never existed. They're a D&D thing. Thieves' guilds are very much what D&D is. Warhammer is about gangs. Warhammer is about different groups that get together for social or perhaps even political or community-based reasons, perhaps for ethnic reasons. They gang together and they take control of certain things, often for the betterment of themselves and their families or whatever else may be. Remember, your worst gangster has their own family, has their own things that they're doing. They're real people. They're real people wrapped up in whatever criminal organization that they work for, or just very small criminal organizations in other places. There is no great thieves guild, no great Ranald runs the great thieves guild. No, they don't. There's just lots of gangs, and there's Ranald, the god, working with them in individual ways. And Middenheim was the book that established that tone, because it broke down that idea of a thieves guild, and it said it directly in the book. There is no thieves guild in Middenheim, because that's stupid. What there is a host of gangs. This is how they work. Now, admittedly, some of the gang names that they chose were stupid. Fricking the Big Cheese, Edom Gouda, has the worst name that has ever been used, Edom Gouda, by any book ever. And I can't believe they didn't change that for the new book. I actually wrote a note saying change the name, and they freaking didn't. I'm literally tearing my hat off in frustration without doing so, because I can't be bothered. But there are gangs across, and they are each gathered in different places. The Man, for example, is basically a shadowy figure, not finger, that'd be weird, a shadowy figure behind many of the worst atrocities that happens across Middenheim, whether it's dealing with illicit substances, dealing with prostitution, basically dealing with anything that's illegal that people want. It's all handled by various gang groups, all of whom have got various issues with each other, and have managed to keep external groups out of the city. And there has been various attempts from groups outside the city to move in. One example of that, for example, is the equivalent of Marks and Spencer's. For those of you who are British, Marks and Spencer's is a big chain store in the UK that deals largely with clothes and food for the middle class. And there is an equivalent, L&S, sitting inside, rather than M&S, it's L&S, sitting inside the Warhammer world, called Luigi and Salvatore. Luigi and Salvatore were first added to the Warhammer background in Warhammer Quest as a special place that your Imperial Noble could go and visit. Your Imperial Noble could go to and visit a branch of L&S, and there's branches in every major city in the, well, pretty much the Empire, all of them. Visit a branch of L&S to pick up some special noble stuff, because Marks and Spencer's cater to the middle classes and the upper classes, don't you know? So you can pop to L&S. L&S in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay version is also a hotbed of criminality, because the Warhammer world isn't connected in the same way the real world is. But L&S is rich. They're a Attilian group that has moved in and opened branch after branch after branch. And one of the reasons that they open the branches is effectively to act as fences. And they buy stolen material and then ship it to another branch where it'll never be recognized and sell it there like it's new or it's something special. And they spread it around all over the place. Now, the good old L&S branch in Middenheim, as of yet, has never turned to criminality, isn't selling stuff that's stolen from elsewhere purely because they are afraid to go against the Low Kings. The Low Kings have got a particular grip over the city and its criminality, and they're fully aware of who L&S are, and they're fully aware of what they represent, and they have made their own threats and made it very clear that if they try to muscle in any of their territory, the whole branch comes down. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to be willing to use them as fences, because after all, they're rich. So the stolen goods will still work through there, but it'll be flowing outwards and not in. They're not going to be making money off of that city, not without paying a tax to one of the Low Kings. Cut a long story short, we have the Low Kings, which is a group of gangs that work inside Middenheim. I was deeply disappointed, as I mentioned already, to see that the newest edition of the book said there's no Thieves Guild here, in a way to suggest that there was Thieves Guild elsewhere. And I was like, no, the first book was speaking to the D&D crowd. Oh, you don't need to say it in this book. It was unnecessary. God damn it. But yes, Luigi and Salvatore.
If you're watching this now, you know. All right, let's get into questions to make sure we hammer these out real quick. So we got Scythe Pedals asking why did Teclis hate Middenheim so much he stole the Sacred Flame when he had a perfectly good one and old one to use. In fairness to the end times, they do actually explain that the Sacred Flame of Assurin gets all sucked up by Malekith when he becomes the Eternity King. So it's gone. It goes out because he takes what's left of it. So there was none left. So Teclis was like, what's the other Sacred Flame I've heard about? I'll just yoink that shit and doom everybody there to die, which does not... Teclis would never do that. He would literally never do that.
It is, of all the plot lines, when we get to our second stream, I will freaking rant about it. Because, seriously!
Brady. Oh, okay. Okay, here's an interesting one. Brady says, in the Vampire Wars trilogy, which was by Steven...
Steve Saville.
Jarek, as a vampire, was not burned by the white flame of Ulric. Do you believe that this is an odd story choice or something bigger at play?
I think both. I know Steve really well. Steve's a great guy. He's if you want to see me have a chat with him over on Inside the Rookery, our very first episode ever was with Steve Saville, and our 101st episode as well, I think. So I think it's our first and 101st, and we did that on purpose. So he came back to do another episode. He's got some beautiful stories about stuff about J.R.R. Martin and G.R.R. Martin. I'm losing it. Anyway, Steve's a great guy. And he did a couple of weird things with that book. And I remember calling them out with him. He was like, yeah, whatevs. And Yeah, pretty much. Almost. Yeah, and it's a great story. And I was like, yeah, sure, good point. And I think it was, yes, an odd one. And I think that odd one deserves extra attention because it's telling a story that I think perhaps could have had a little bit more time spent on it.
Yeah, I will say, to be fair to that story, it's not terribly dissimilar from like old stories about Genevieve literally being able to like manifest the power of Sigmar, which is very weird. By, like,
which is a take.
Yeah, so it's like it's not completely alone in that category.
Yep, totally true.
Tarmakon, Boris Toddbringer is supposed to be in charge here. The place is like the center of Ulric worship, but Toddbringer's original concept was to be Sigmar reborn, to my understanding. As someone who likes to combine the different, even conflicting aspects of the lore, how the hell does Andy Law reckon this in his own canon? Or is Toddbringer just not as significant to Sigmar in his version?
Okay, let's just make sure this is clear for anyone who's watching so that they understand, and that there is minor spoilers to, in fact, a pretty big spoiler to the first version of The Enemy Within. So if you're not interested in how that, if you, pardon me, are interested in how that pans out, just stop listening for the next minute. So in the first version of The Enemy Within, Heinrich Toddbringer, that's the son of Boris Toddbringer, was Sigmar reborn. Not a possibility, pretty much just was. And he was destined to get hold of the Hammer of Sigmar, kick ass, chew gum, and bring an end to all proceedings. Karl Franz, as you know him from the current version of Warhammer, was Heinrich Toddbringer. They changed his name. Karl Franz dies in The Enemy Within. That's what happens. Now, obviously, that isn't the case for the modern lore because Heinrich Toddbringer no longer is that figure. He does not become emperor. He does not wield the hammer. He does not ride a griffin. He is not the guy. Karl Franz is instead. Now, is Karl Franz a direct heir of Sigmar? Yes. According to some books, he most certainly is. According to others, there's no chance on earth he ever could be because he's from such a weak-blooded bloodline. Depends upon which book you read. Now, when we look at the whole thing and we say, so now if we're trying to merge two versions, what do? Well, hell, Sigmar gets reborn every other Sunday, doesn't he? And that's not even including the bloody Festags. In that we've got people like Valten, we've got the people like the Child in the Thousand Thrones, we've got people like Heinrich Toddbringer. There is nothing to say that Sigmar reborn is nothing more than a manifestation of Sigmar's direct, let's say, genes. Reforming and creating our big god king-like individual. You could do it that way if you wished. Alternatively, you could say that he literally was that and the Chaos Gods did whatever they could to ensure that he was sidelined. That would be a good way of resolving it. There's no proper answer for this. If you want one, the best answer I can give you is make one that you like.
Ulric, Sigmar, and the Holy Hammer. Also, I love someone thinking Zhao Ming is Sigmar reborn. You know, the guy who was born thousands of years before Sigmar. The dragon. Let's see.
I think we missed a super comment as well from Ryan.
Yeah. Ryan Woodall, on a scale of 1 to 10, how corrupt is the county of Middenheim compared to other counties of the Empire? 1 being absolutely corrupt and 10 being an example for the other counties.
Just as corrupt as the rest. For all the individuals are super honorable, there's just as many who super aren't. As we've already discussed, you've got the low kings, you've got the fact that this place is not a democracy or even coming close to democracy. This place is not even strictly speaking a proper feudal society. This place is an absolute monarch. And that absolute monarch is Boris Toddbringer. And that absolute monarch has the absolute authority to do anything he wants whenever he wants. And there is a certain lack of accountability that then moves down as you move through the ranks. People take whatever they can take. But at their heart, Ulricans and Teutigans are honorable. Ranaldin deeds are very much seen to be the antithesis of what it is to be a Teutigan. So you could argue there that they are thus better people, but no, they're not, because they also believe that might is right. They believe that if they're capable of taking a... Yeah, they're violent. If they believe that they can take a thing, they often will take a thing. Society is quite different in Middenheim in comparison to, say, Altdorf, which is corrupt in a completely different way. I would say you're looking at a number right in the middle. It is as corrupt as elsewhere. It certainly is not a paragon of somewhere that is good to look at. It has a lot of systemic issues, but that's why its watch is so important, incredibly important, arguably. The 3 Midden Marshals, one of them is responsible for just holding the watch. And that watch is a policing watch because crime is prevalent. But then it's prevalent in most cities in the Empire. It's not exactly a new thing.
Yep. Circuit Guy asked kind of a meta question for Mr. Law. Back during Storm of Chaos, Middenheim had the big old cannon called Ulric's Thunder, but modern sources seemingly never mentioned the weapon. Do you know the reason why it's not mentioned anymore, and do you think there are ever any plans to bring it back?
It's because it's stupid. That's the reason, and I'm not going to mince my words. Most people think the idea of having a giant loading a giant cannon with a giant cannonball, firing the thing and watching it recoil like mad, breaking its chains that hold it in place, is stupid, and they don't like it. I am not of that opinion. I think it's properly bonkers, and I like it. It's very much a part of my Middenheim, and if I'd stuck in the production job and it hadn't been included in the Middenheim book, I would have added it because it is a part of the established lore, and it's a fun one because it's really stupid. It's really over the top. It's the sort of stupid
How
things.
much metal do we have in the city? We can fire it like twice.
It's the sort of stupid thing that an absolute monarch would do. It would be their crazy project, the stupid thing that they would try to make it work. This is, after all, not a medieval world. This is freaking Warhammer, where they've got giant wizards and giant money and giant this and giant that and giants. I see no reason that this sort of thing couldn't happen. And it's one of the things I actually like about Warhammer, the fact that we do have these dialed up to 11 crazy moments, and then you get the roleplay game to examine it and show you just why it's stupid and why it doesn't work and why it's broken and how it could, under the correct circumstances, save so many lives if it did actually work in practice. So building those different versions of it is what the roleplay game is all about. It's looking at the crazy things and establishing how they'd work in reality. And the fact that that wasn't tackled, I felt, was such a shame, because it could have been such a lovely 300-word little article explaining how Ulric's Thunder was one of the biggest follies, but equally could very well save the city.
Yeah. That one would have been a fun one of just like exploring, like, man, how many people in Middenheim like went hungry because they were pouring all the coppers into making this stupid cannon. And like, man, that giant is hard to keep under control.
Oh yeah.
Make sure he's got food. All right, so we've got questions from Jiggy here. Some of these are pretty specific to the enemy within storyline, so if you want to skip any of them for spoiler reasons, feel free to just say skip.
And if they're spoilers, I'll happily just skip over them. But if I can give an answer that's non-spoilerific, I will do my very best.
Okay, this one does have an interesting question to it, though I feel like you're going to want to skip the first part. So it says, considering that the heir of Boris Todbringer is mentally unstable, are there any regions, magical or mundane, that exist in Warhammer that could theoretically fix it? Considering magic can make you insane, is there a chance magic can make you not insane?
So yes is the answer to that one. Stefan, who is the heir to Middenheim, not Heinrich Todbringer, who is a bastard. Stefan is a pureborn kid. And he is physically and arguably mentally disabled. Could he be reinvigorated with magic? And the answer is yes. There would obviously be a cost. Light magic, for example, is known for being able to order a destabilized mind. Jade magic is known for being able to help cure certain illnesses. But the important word here is not so much cure as it helps things grow. And sometimes a lot of illnesses, if you make it grow, it gets much, much worse. Using jade magic on a cancer, for example, is just going to kill you. It's just not going to work.
The important thing about magic is you got to try and, it's never this. It's never that simple snap solution. You got to think of every potential consequence of how that magic is going to interact with other things.
And that pure magic of Heish could indeed help resolve some matters. But I'll add a big but. The fact that it hasn't is the question the book should have answered. Now, this is something that's missing in the book as it stands, because sadly, the Power Behind the Throne book didn't receive a full development of extra detail. It basically is just the original Power Behind the Throne with a couple of edges worn off and a couple of extra bits added in, but has done very little to address what modern Warhammer would have done to it. And one of the big questions is, why isn't Stefan better, given how freaking important he is? Every single wizard that could have been employed would have been up there to try and resolve it. And instead, we have ourselves a rather daft Tillian doctor. Why? And that question wasn't answered. So that's the sort of question, if you're running the game, you should answer. I know I have for my version of the game.
Let's see. Next question. Is Katarina Toddbringer dead after the Enemy Within storyline? Why does she kind of look like Lindsay, same as Emmanuel von Leibowitz? What happened after the falling out of her engagement with Carl's nephew, if she lived, or did she die a spinster? There's a lot of questions in that question.
And sadly, the answer to all of that is it depends upon what you do in your game. The canon version of it is frequently forgotten, though the characters that aren't Boris Toddbringer are often not mentioned anywhere other than the role-playing game. So you have the freedom to do whatever you wish. It is worth saying that and the original version of the game as we were going to build it, she was going to be a key component of it in a way that she isn't. And that key component almost certainly will be the case for the version that we do with Lorehammer.
Excited. What was the city's inhabitants' initial reaction when they suddenly lost control over now Nordland, but instead gained control over the lands to the east of the Drakewald? I'm assuming supply lines were cut. That's a lot of very specifics.
That's a big one. So the conclusion of the Enemy Within campaign, if you go with the conclusion that is presented there, has Nordland become independent and Middenland become underneath the thumb of Middenheim. And what would be the ramifications of that? Fucking huge. No other way of putting it. It's enormous. Nordland is really, really, really not a rich province. Middenland, by comparison, really is. So yeah, the coffers in Middenheim are massively going to inflate. There's going to be civil issues across the ground, or alternatively, lots who prefer it this way. Down in the south in Karaberg, yeah, that's going to be a thing. They're not going to be happy. The Bildhofens down there, are they going to be happy having been removed as elector counts? Oh, by the gods, is this going to be difficult? It almost certainly causes more problems than it fixes.
Let's see. I think we already talked about like size issues with Middenheim, the fact that it's like built on a mountain and there's different editions that have made it different kinds of sizes, and an Iowa joke, which I will nod. Let's see. So another question about why didn't Middenheim expand downwards? Like, why didn't the city dig into the Fauschlag? I think we kind of answered that. There's a lot of tunnels and there's already previous established things back there, and it's spooky as fuck.
So yeah, there's the desire not to. Which I'm a little sad wasn't really hinted at a bit more heavily in the book, which is that there's such
a great adventure book for a party. Is like, hey, we want to dig down. Why don't y'all go clear out some space?
Yeah, there's a strong presence of Gur down there, which instinctually makes people shy away from it. They don't go down. The only ones that do are the dwarves, and at least in my version, the dwarves have sunk down a bit underneath the Wind and around that area, inhabiting some of the old tunnels. That's where the Shrine of Grundny is down there, and various other old recovered areas that they've got. So my dwarves are in that area, but what you want to do with it's up to you. But for me, the core reason is that it's scary.
And there you go. To be fair, I mean, there are places in our world that people don't build into in the modern day because they're spooky as fuck. And we're like, oh, we're so civilized society and we don't have literal magic. So, you know, let's see. Question, since Baron Heinrich, so one of Toddbringer's kiddos, is 6'11", who is his mother?
So she's an Ixa. Oh no, she's not. Let me just go make sure I go with the correct one. No, she's not. It's a Richthofen. Maria Richthofen, as I recall. So that's one of the other family lines, and not one known for its giants. The true blood, as I recall, comes down the. Is it the Richthofen side? I need to go double check the bloodline. It's been a wee while since I checked it. But the blood of Sigmar, if you will, is inherited down into. Thing. It makes me want to go check it up. I'm going to go check that up as we go because that's really bugging me.
While you're doing that, okay. So this question you mentioned earlier, I don't know if you want to give your answer to it of why do the Order of the Knights Panther swear fealty to the Toddbringer family in Middenheim?
Well, that's a really interesting one because it was at the very core of my last episode of Lorehammer, pardon me.
Go watch Lorehammer. There you go.
But I'm not going to tell you if I answer it or not in there. I'm simply going to say that is at the core of it. And at some point, it will be discussed in detail in our streams.
Let's see. And then in the Enemy Chalice campaign, it says that nobles mess with free towns and settlements. I don't know why that. I don't know how this pertains to the rest of the question. So basically, the question asks, why hasn't Toddbringer just wiped out the Low Kings?
Right. No, still, Stefan is from Richthofen. I always get confused as to which one. Nick's. Oh, I can't find Heinrich. This is really bugging me. I'll check it later. Anyway, I'll come back. Come into my.
We'll come back to that.
Come into my Discord channel and I'll get it all out there because I'm going to be doing a new bloodline for the Toddbringers anyway. So we'll pop it up in there.
Okay.
So what was that question? I missed. I missed the question.
No, you're good. Why hasn't Toddbringer simply not wiped out the Low Kings?
Why? I mean, why? He has absolute authority. He gets everything that he wants. That's just part of his populace. They don't influence or affect him in any real shape or form. Yeah, there's crime out there, but that's what the Watch are for. They're the ones that go down and resolve out that business. Yeah, it's quite separate from his life. His day-to-day concerns are court. The day-to-day concerns of what's happening down in the darker quarters of the Alt Quarter or over in, I don't know, over in the Osttor or whatever it might be that they've got issues over in Ostfold, pardon me. That's really not a concern for him in the slightest. The big question is, what would make him want to do that? And once you've got that answered, then you've got movement. Yep.
Helfier, are there any children of Ulric living within the city of Middenheim?
Yeah, loads of them.
Yep. Okay. This I'm curious which answer will be to this one. Sidepedal asks, who are the Wolfkin, which were a career introduced with the Middenheim book from Cubicle 7? And what is their relationship with Middenheim, the city?
Good question. Not read the book, so I don't want to answer that until I've read it. I have my version of the Middenheim book, which is mine. But I could check it up for you because I do have the book. So
ping him on the Discord, and I'm sure he'll get around to that.
Yeah, I'll get around to that one over the Discord because I've got my own
this
version.
is a cool question. Grey Fate, what is the biggest trade export and import for Middenheim?
Import food.
Food. But what's the export?
Food. Okay, so there's a variety of different answers to this. They've got themselves quite a bit of industry that sits down in the south side of the city. And a lot of that industry is centered around dwarf and dwarfen stuff. And also the equivalent from the various metal workers from the human side. If you take a look through the various quarters of the city, none of them are great manufacturing centers. Middenheim, it appears, is not a great manufacturing center. So you'll find that its greatest artifacts are almost certainly going to be religion. His greatest export is Ulric.
Blessed goodies, like, oh, this is near the flame. Our Ulric touched this. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's going to be with the vast majority of because the number of pilgrims they receive is really significant coming to see the sacred flame. Every Ulrican is meant to view that sacred flame. And there's Ulricans not only all over the empire, but all over the old world as a whole. So yeah, this is a city of pilgrims, which is easy to forget because we often think of them as the city of Teutigans. But yeah, it's a city of pilgrims and its primary export is religion.
Okay, and then I think the last question that I think is really pertinent would be, if I understand correctly, the mountains to the east of Middenheim hide the Brass Keep, which is true. Does this have a major impact on the city of Middenheim?
No, not a major one. Brass Keep is a fascinating place because it was added during the Storm of Chaos.
You keep answering this. I have to use the restroom. I'm going to explode.
Okay. All by myself. Okay, so Brass Keep is a fascinating place because it was first introduced during the Storm of Chaos books. And it was a great keep up in the mountains that got captured and was thus filled with Chaos warriors. And they worked from there, and eventually it's where Archaon retreats to and is in at the end of the Storm of Chaos. So it became associated with Chaos. Then we go to Sigmar books, and they decided that Graham McNeil went, you know what, I'm going to use that location, and he makes Brass Keep, which was up to that point a relatively new build, suddenly 2,500 years old. And it gets associated with Chaos throughout all of that time. And indeed is somehow still filled with Chaos Warriors in the time of, pretty much every version that it's used. So Does that affect things? No, not really. It's just people are raiding from there, and it's really quite distant from Middenheim. It might seem like it's really close, but when you're in the sort of world they're in, it's not only distant, it's like many, many miles away. It's also high up in the mountains, deep into the middle mountains. So the effect of it is nothing more than a besieging camp to keep them away from the rest of the Duchy of Middenheim. There's really very little bigger effect other than the political ramifications of having such a thing so nearby.
Yeah, there is some notes in like I think 7th and 8th edition where like Toddbringer has attempted to take down Brass Keep and it does not go well. Any armies that have attacked Brass Keep are never seen again. Like there's no survivors. It's just a total wipe.
Yeah, I do find it an interesting change that it's had because originally it was just part of his territory.
Yeah, so it's an interesting place. And like Andy said, it plays a weirdly big role in the Sigmar trilogy. Like Morath the Necromancer takes up shop there for a while. Which is like, okay. There's a big fight between Morath. That's where Sigmar actually gets the crown of the Gash, is from Brass Keep. So that's a whole thing. And of course,
I'd forgotten that's where the bloody crown was. Of course it was.
Place.
Of course it was. I remember now.
And then in the end times, of course, it plays a key role because that's where the Magath riders get their army of the Putrid Blight Kings from. And it's revealed that the Brass Keep, despite being called the Brass Keep, is actually like a super Nurgle fortress by the time people find it. Which, I mean, to be fair, it's been like stagnating there for thousands of years. So it's like, it's all right.
Makes as much sense as anything else.
Yeah, it's whatever. Anyway, so yeah, a fun little history lesson there. And that's pretty much all the questions. So we've got some last little super chats to get here, and then we're pretty much good, I think.
All righty.
So we've got, Ryan Woodall here. Last question. Ulric's flame and many other qualities of the gods seem capable of combating chaos. If they are so powerful, then why do the gods let their world get trampled by demons and chaos? That's
a big question.
Yeah, that's a giant question.
Okay, so that's a question that has no actual answer in the lore that is spelled out in lovely black and white. It's a question that you can only answer by looking between the lines and realizing what's up. But at its very simplest, at some point, the gods left because it was the only thing they could do. Why? And that is bluntly the question that needs answered. For your game and your headcanon, you can go anywhere you want. I have my own headcanon, and it is laid behind most of the writing that I've done, and it's something that most certainly will be examined during my gamey streams because they'll go there eventually, and we'll need to discuss it. It'll be fun.
Yeah, there's no easy answer. There's a lot of theories. Like I imagine my theory, I could give you theories and they'd probably be very different than what Andy would say, but it's just one of those things you kind of have to decide for yourself. Commander Bone, darn, late again. Hi Sotek, Andy, quick question. Have you talked about the Children of Ulric? Not a lot, a little bit. Because remember, this is more of a Middenheim stream, not an Ulric stream. Also, big question. Children of Ulric is regular in hero units for Middenheim for tabletop and for Total War Warhammer, lore friendly or not? That's hard to answer.
Not lore friendly, but you could make it lore friendly.
Yes.
Because they are basically extremists and fanatics that are outlawed by the primary cult, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't come to terms with who they are come the end times, which is what the Total War games are about. So come the end times, they could be accepted with a nice little story, allowing them to be an integrated part of a Middenland, Ulric, Toddbringer, whatever you wish army in the north of the Empire.
Yeah, most established lore has the Children of Ulric not on good terms with the cult. Like borderline kill on sight terms. Yeah, CP4N. Quick, while Sotek is gone, when is Criminal Street?
Next week!
I was too fast. Back already. All right. And I think that is all the questions answered. Do you have some... Oh, wait. No, I wanted to show something real quick. So Hammond sent me this. Hold on. Hammond sent me this, and I just wanted to show it on stream very, very, very briefly. Gee, Middenheim, how come GW lets you have 2 apocalypses? Because I'm the city of the White Wolf.
White Wolf. Just to bring up that one, and yes, that's largely where we were going.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about. Yeah, if literally any Black Library story, which there's a couple where children of Ulric show up, if an Ulrican sees them, they will like try to kill them.
They wouldn't, because he's depending upon which part of the timeline you're in, he is either the patriarch, the supreme patriarch, or a nobody. One of those things. I know they wouldn't body him. He's sadly an accepted part of the storyline. No, I would use him sympathetically. I understand where he lies. That doesn't mean that he's not a dick.
Yeah. Loremaster's 5K win quick this month by the end of March.
It's getting worked on right now.
Yes,
He's constantly working away on the side. Don't worry, but I would strongly recommend out there, don't bug him too much. It'll just add stress. He trust him that he's doing it. It will come when it's ready. And I don't know about you, but I'd much rather he did the work properly, took the time that's needed to finish it off. But the work is occurring right now.
Yeah, I will actually give just a very brief update as far as the video that was before Queek, like the last video before Queek that we really wanted to get done is done. Like done. It's uploaded and everything. That was going to come out this week, which means Queek is headliner now, which is great. My editor is literally already started on it. I've already recorded over about an hour worth of dialogue. So their dialogue, audio, there we go. So hopefully it'll be worth the wait. We'll see. Andy, do you kind of have a wrap up touching on the important aspects of Middenheim for us?
Yeah, I do actually. Middenheim is awesome. And it's awesome for multiple reasons. It's awesome because it's the very first city that was ever properly detailed by Games Workshop in Warhammer. It's the first place that got a proper, full background, assessment, detail from the ground to the top, and thus it holds a special place in Warhammer history. That special place was recognized throughout the course of Warhammer's history as it arrived again and again in various supplements, in various stories, in various parts of the background, and come the end times, was recognized for the importance that it had in the history of Warhammer by being also the place where Warhammer came to an end. It's a city that, if you look into its detail, is redolent with super cool stuff. Now, we've discussed some of it, but because this is a city that has had a lot written about it, I strongly recommend you go out there, have a good check through it all, because there's loads of cool bits and pieces there, including the all too marvelous sport of Middenball, a sport that I recommend you all take up, and I have indeed even written rules for my own games using a Blood Bowl field, because how could you not? Because that's just too awesome. And as Andy mentioned, well, it was awesome until the stinking purple hand turned up. Hey, Andy.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Oh, Gary.
Last couple things as we're wrapping up. Just a reminder that there will be a new Lorebeards vote for what the next subject is going to be over here on this channel, and then it'll be over on Andy's channel. Also, if you haven't already, please go watch the Who Would Win episode that we did on Andy's channel, and then go vote on my channel. There's a link to that in the pinned comments for
please Andy. Do, because I'm loving these Who Would Wins, because they're going literally nowhere that I would expect. And
yeah, the last one was bonkers.
Yeah, proper bonkers.
And we also have the next Who Would Wins already scheduled for this Wednesday. We're doing Tehenwin versus Lord Skrulk, which should be a lot of fun.
That should be a lot of fun.
Good old Skaven and Lizardman matchup. And I based on how bizarre the last one went, I'm really curious where this one's gonna go.
Who knows?
Yeah, if you haven't already, make sure you're subbed to Lawhammer, because remember, once we get to 10K on Lawhammer, then we have to do a Lorebeards episode on Gelt.
Fuck off.
So it'll be Andy tortured.
Yeah, that'd be worth it.
And I'm really excited to see the growth over on Andy's channel. It is really, really hype stuff. Because I think we actually crossed the 5K threshold during the last Who Would Win?
Yes, we did. We did 5K last one. And I'm always going to bring this up because if you didn't know already, my lovely company with my bestest buds, including Andy, who's just literally been on, and Lindsay over in our streams, and Mark Gibbons, the artist extraordinaire, are releasing Dardies very soon. I just popped the link up for you all to go check up there and subscribe. You're not subscribing for anything other than getting the details for when it gets released so you can go buy it. And please do. It makes all the difference to us. We are just a little indie publisher. And it's full of extraordinary humor that fits Warhammer. Mwah, chef kiss wise, particularly because it was designed by two of Warhammer's bestest people. So yes, do go check it out.
Excellent. And that is going to be it for us today. So thank you all for watching. We hope we'll see you on Wednesday. And yeah, take care. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.